Some choices in life haunt you forever, and some pleas echo in your heart long after the words fade into silence. In the unforgiving territory of the Arizona frontier, where justice was measured by the barrel of a gun and tradition held more weight than mercy, a giant of a man named Caleb Stone faced a choice that would define him forever. The towering cowboy had spent 15 years upholding frontier law without question, his reputation built on unwavering adherence to the code. But when he heard those desperate words, "Please, I'm begging you, unchain me," spoken by a young Apache girl shackled in the town square, something ancient stirred within his weathered heart. The settlers expected him to look away, to let tradition run its course. The girl's dark eyes held no hope, only raw desperation. What could possibly make a man like Caleb Stone, loyal, principled, and respected, throw away everything he'd built to save someone the entire territory had condemned? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona Territory in 1878 was not a forgiving place. It was a land of extremes, scorching days that could kill a man if he wasn't careful, and nights so cold they made your bones ache. The town of Redemption Springs sat in a valley between red rock cliffs that turned golden at sunset. A small collection of wooden buildings that represented civilization's fragile foothold in an untamed wilderness. Caleb Stone had called this place home for 15 years, though he'd never been entirely sure whether that word truly fit. Home was supposed to be warm, welcoming, a place where you felt at peace. Redemption Springs was none of those things. It was hard, dust-covered, and perpetually on edge. But it was where he'd ended up after the war, after losing everything that mattered. And sometimes a man just stayed where he landed, because moving required more hope than he could muster. At 6 feet 5 inches tall and broad as an oak barrel, Caleb cut an imposing figure. His face was weathered like old leather, lined with the kind of creases that came from squinting into too many sunsets and carrying too many burdens. His hair, once dark as coal, had gone silver at the temples, and his beard, which he kept trimmed short, showed more grey than he cared to admit. His hands were massive, scarred from a lifetime of hard work and harder fights, but they could be surprisingly gentle when the situation called for it. He wore the silver badge of a territorial ranger on his chest, pinned over a faded blue shirt that had seen better days. His gun belt sat low on his hips, the holster worn smooth from years of use. The Colt revolver it held was immaculately maintained, a tool he respected but never loved. Violence had been a constant companion in his life. From the battlefields of the Civil War to the dusty streets of frontier towns. But it had never brought him anything but sorrow. Every morning, Caleb rose before dawn in his small cabin on the edge of town. The place was sparse. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a stove, and shelves lined with a few books he'd read so many times. The pages were soft as cloth. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a worn leather Bible, its cover cracked and faded. It had belonged to his father, a Pennsylvania preacher who'd raised his son to believe in mercy, justice, and the fundamental dignity of every human soul. Those lessons felt like they belonged to a different lifetime now. Caleb would make his coffee strong and bitter, drink it standing at his window while watching the sun creep over the eastern cliffs. Then he'd pin on his badge, check his revolver, and walk the quarter-mile into town to begin his rounds. It was a routine that had sustained him through countless empty days, a structure that kept him from thinking too much about what his life had become. The town itself was a collection of contradictions. Main Street ran straight through the center, flanked by a general store, a saloon, a church, a hotel, and the sheriff's office. There was a livery stable, a blacksmith, a doctor's office that doubled as the undertaker's parlor, and about 30 residential homes scattered in the surrounding area. Maybe 200 souls called Redemption Springs home, depending on the season and whether you counted the families on the outlying ranches. Most folks here were decent people, trying to make honest livings in a difficult place. They were ranchers, Farmers, merchants, and tradesmen who'd come west seeking opportunity or escape. Some found what they were looking for. Others discovered that you can't outrun your past, no matter how far you travel. But they all shared one thing in common: a fierce determination to survive in a land that tested them daily. Sheriff Marcus Mackenzie was the closest thing Caleb had to a friend. The older man had held his position for 23 years, and he'd seen the territory transform from lawless wilderness to something resembling civilization. He was in his 60s now, moving slower than he used to, his once sharp eyes requiring spectacles for reading. But his mind remained keen, and his understanding of human nature was unmatched. Mackenzie had been the one to pin the ranger badge on Caleb's chest 15 years ago, recognizing in the broken war veteran a man who needed purpose more than comfort. The sheriff had taught him the unwritten codes that governed frontier justice, codes that were often harsher than any written law. Out here, mercy was seen as weakness, and weakness got people killed. You enforced the rules without exception, maintained order through strength, and never let personal feelings interfere with duty. Caleb had learned those lessons well. Too well, perhaps. Then there was Sarah Brennan, who ran the general store with quiet efficiency. She was a widow in her early 40s, having lost her husband to pneumonia 6 years back. Her daughter had died in childbirth a year before that, taking Sarah's only grandchild with her. The double loss had carved deep lines around her eyes, but it hadn't broken her spirit. She had auburn hair streaked with silver that she wore in a practical bun, and green eyes that still held warmth despite the sorrows they'd witnessed. Sarah had always been kind to Caleb, in a way that suggested she understood the loneliness that haunted him. They'd shared coffee on her porch a few times, talking about small things: the weather, the price of goods, gossip about town residents. Nothing more than friendly conversation between two people who'd both learned that life doesn't always give you what you hope for. But there was something comfortable about her presence, something that reminded him there were still small mercies to be found in the world. The town council consisted of 5 men who made the major decisions for Redemption Springs. There was Reverend Thomas Hartwell, an earnest man in his 50s who genuinely tried to bring spiritual guidance to the community. There was Doc Morrison, who'd seen enough suffering to make him philosophical about human nature. There was Samuel Tucker, who owned the largest ranch in the area and wielded corresponding influence. There was Benjamin Cross, the banker who controlled the town's limited finances. And then there was Coleman Wade. Wade was a relative newcomer, having arrived 3 years ago with enough money to buy a sizable spread of land and enough charisma to quickly establish himself as a voice of authority. He was a tall man with dark hair and darker eyes, handsome in a way that made women take notice and men feel vaguely threatened. He spoke with confidence about frontier values, strength, tradition, the importance of maintaining order against the chaos that surrounded them. Caleb had never warmed to Wade, though he couldn't articulate exactly why. There was something about the man that felt calculated, as if every word and gesture was designed to produce a specific effect. But Wade was popular with many townspeople, particularly those who felt anxious about the ongoing conflicts with Apache tribes in the region. Those conflicts had been escalating for years. The Apache people had inhabited these lands for generations before white settlers arrived, and they had not relinquished their territory willingly. Raids on ranches and settlements were common, as were retaliatory strikes by settler militias. It was a brutal cycle of violence that left bodies on both sides and fostered deep hatred between the communities. The territorial government's policy was clear: Apache. Raiders were to be captured and punished according to frontier law. That law was harsh by any measure, designed more for deterrence than justice. Public punishment, often followed by hanging or imprisonment, was meant to send a message that attacks on settlers would not be tolerated. Caleb had enforced that law without question for 15 years. He'd tracked raiders, made arrests, and stood witness at executions. He'd told himself he was maintaining order, protecting innocent people, doing what needed to be done in a savage land. And in truth, some of those he'd brought to justice had been genuinely dangerous men who would have killed again given the chance. But lately, something had been shifting inside him. Maybe it was age creeping up on him. Maybe it was the accumulation of too many hard memories. Or maybe it was the way his father's Bible sat on that mantle, a silent rebuke every time he came home after a particularly difficult day. He'd started noticing things he'd trained himself to ignore. The fear in the eyes of captured raiders who were barely more than boys. The way Apache women wailed when their men were taken away. The fact that settler violence against Apache families often went unpunished, while Apache violence against settlers brought swift retribution. The system wasn't balanced, and he'd been part of that imbalance for a long time. These thoughts troubled him, but he'd kept them buried. A man in his position couldn't afford doubt. Doubt led to hesitation, and hesitation got people killed. So he'd continued his routine, pinning on his badge each morning and doing what was expected of him, trying not to think too deeply about whether expected and right were always the same thing. His small cabin held few personal possessions, but the ones he kept were meaningful. Besides his father's Bible, there was a tintype photograph in a wooden frame that he kept in a drawer, unable to look at it too often, but unwilling to throw it away. It showed a younger Caleb with his wife Mary and their daughter Emma, taken in Pennsylvania before the war. They were smiling, hopeful, unaware that fever would take both of them while Caleb was off fighting in Virginia. He'd come home to 2 fresh graves and a world that no longer made sense. After that, moving west had seemed less like a choice, and more like the only direction left to go when everything behind you was ashes. There was also a small wooden horse he'd carved for Emma when she was 4 years old. It was crude work, the proportions all wrong, but she'd loved it fiercely. He'd found it among her things after she died and had carried it with him ever since. A reminder of what love felt like before grief buried it so deep he could barely remember. The morning routines, the badge, the rigid adherence to duty, these things had become his armor against feeling too much. If he stayed busy, stayed focused on the task at hand, he could make it through each day without drowning in memories of what he'd lost. But armor, no matter how strong, always has weak points. On this particular morning in late September, Caleb rose as usual before dawn. The air had a crisp edge that promised winter wasn't far off. He made his coffee, drank it at the window, and watched the sun paint the cliffs in shades of amber and rose. He pinned his badge over his heart, checked his revolver, and walked into town. The streets were mostly empty at this hour. A few shopkeepers were opening their establishments, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery. Caleb exchanged nods with the people he passed, the kind of minimal acknowledgement that characterized most of his social interactions. He stopped at the sheriff's office, where Mackenzie was already at his desk, reading a week-old newspaper that had arrived on yesterday's stage. "Morning." "Caleb," the sheriff said without looking up. "Marcus," Caleb replied, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. "Anything I should know about?" "Quiet night," Mackenzie said. "Tucker's boys got drunk and rowdy at the saloon, but nothing serious. Wade stopped by yesterday asking about increasing patrols on the eastern ranches. Says he's heard rumors of Apache movement in that area." Caleb felt his jaw tighten. Wade was always advocating for more aggressive action against the Apache, always pushing for harsher measures. "Any actual evidence of trouble or just rumors?" "Just rumors," Mackenzie admitted. "But folks are nervous. Can't blame them after what happened to the Thornton family last month. The Thornton raid had been brutal. 3 dead, the ranch burned, livestock scattered. The raiders had disappeared into the mountains before any pursuit could be organized. It was the kind of incident that inflamed tensions and made people eager for retribution. "I'll ride out that direction today," Caleb said. "Take a look around." Mackenzie nodded approvingly. "Good man. Oh, and one more thing. Wade's calling a town council meeting for tomorrow evening. Wants to discuss security measures." "You should probably attend," Caleb suppressed a sigh. He hated council meetings. all talk and posturing, with Wade usually dominating the conversation. But attendance was part of his duties. "I'll be there." He finished his coffee and headed back out into the brightening morning. The town was coming to life now, people going about their daily business. Children ran past on their way to the schoolhouse, and wagons rattled down Main Street, carrying supplies. Caleb walked to the livery to get his horse, a big roan gelding named Copper, who'd been his companion for 8 years. The horse nickered in greeting, and Caleb stroked his neck before saddling him. There was something honest about horses. They didn't judge, didn't demand explanations, just gave you their loyalty if you treated them well. He was about to mount when Sarah Brennan appeared, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Caleb," she called out, a slight smile on her face. "I thought you might be heading out today." "Packed you some lunch." He took the bundle, surprised and oddly touched by the gesture. "That's kind of you, Sarah. You didn't have to." "I know," she said simply. "But I wanted to." She paused, her expression becoming more serious. "Be careful out there. There's a lot of anger in the air lately. Makes people do foolish things." "I'm always careful," he assured her, though they both knew that was only partly true. His job required him to walk into danger regularly. "I know you are," she said softly. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "Will you stop by the store when you get back? I'd like to talk to you about something." "Of course," he agreed, curious, but not wanting to press her in the middle of the street. She smiled again, a warmer expression that made her look years younger, and then turned back toward her store. Caleb watched her go for a moment, then swung up into the saddle and pointed Copper toward the eastern trail. The ride out gave him time to think, which was both a blessing and a curse. The landscape was beautiful in the morning light, vast expanses of scrubland, dotted with sage and juniper, red rock formations sculpted by wind and time, distant mountains purple against the horizon. This land could be harsh, but it had a stark beauty that he'd come to appreciate. He thought about Sarah's gesture, the simple kindness of packing him lunch. It had been a long time since anyone had done something like that for him. It reminded him of Mary, who used to pack his meals when he worked long days in their Pennsylvania town. The memory was bittersweet, painful, but also precious. He thought about the Apache conflicts, the cycle of violence that seemed to have no end. He'd seen good people on both sides die for reasons that, in his quieter moments, seemed increasingly unclear. The Apache were defending their ancestral lands. The settlers were trying to build new lives. Both sides saw themselves as righteous, and both sides committed acts of cruelty in the name of survival. Where did justice lie in all of that? And what was his role as someone sworn to enforce the law? These were dangerous questions, the kind that undermined the certainty he needed to do his job. So he pushed them aside, as he always did, and focused on the immediate task, checking the eastern ranches for signs of trouble. He spent the day riding the boundaries of Tucker's land and the neighboring spreads, talking to ranch hands, looking for tracks or other evidence of recent Apache presence. He found nothing alarming, some old signs of passage, but nothing recent or threatening. By late afternoon, he turned Copper back toward town, eating Sarah's lunch in the saddle. She'd packed bread, cheese, dried beef, and an apple. A simple fare, but it tasted better than most meals he made for himself. The sun was setting as he rode back into Redemption Springs, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. He returned Copper to the livery, giving the horse a thorough rub-down and extra oats as thanks for a long day's work. Then he headed toward the general store to see what Sarah wanted to discuss. The store was just closing, but she waved him inside when she saw him approaching. "How was your ride?" she asked, locking the door behind him. "Quiet," he reported. "No signs of immediate trouble." "That's good." She moved behind the counter, her hands fidgeting with a piece of fabric in a way that suggested nervousness. "Caleb, I wanted to ask you something, and I hope you won't think I'm overstepping." "I could never think that," he said honestly. "What's on your mind?" She took a breath, seeming to gather her courage. "There's talk around town about the way we handle Apache prisoners." "Hush talk. Wade's been stirring people up, saying we need to be more severe, make examples. And I know it's not my place to question how law is enforced, but—" She paused, meeting his eyes. Do you ever wonder if we've lost our way? If we've let fear make us cruel? The question landed like a stone in still water, rippling through all his carefully maintained defenses. This was exactly what he'd been trying not to think about, spoken aloud by someone whose opinion he valued. "Sarah," he began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. How could he admit his doubts without admitting that 15 years of his life might have been built on a foundation that was crumbling? "I know," she said quickly. "I know it's complicated. I know you have a duty. I look around this town and I see good people calling for things that don't feel good. And I worry about what we're becoming." He wanted to reassure her, but he couldn't find false comfort to offer. Instead, he said, "I think about it more than I should, probably. But thinking doesn't change what the job requires." "Maybe it should," she said softly. "Maybe thinking is exactly what changes things." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Then Sarah stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to burden you with my worries." "You carry enough as it is. It's not a burden," he assured her. He struggled for the right words. "It's good to know I'm not the only one wondering." She smiled at that, a sad but genuine expression. "You're a good man, Caleb Stone. Don't let this place make you forget that." He left the store, feeling unsettled in a way he couldn't quite name. Sarah's words echoed in his mind as he walked back to his cabin. Maybe thinking is exactly what changes things, but change required courage he wasn't sure he possessed. And the cost of that courage might be everything he'd built his life around for the past 15 years. That night, he sat at his table with his father's Bible open in front of him. He read the familiar passages about mercy and justice, about standing up for the oppressed, about doing what was right even when it was difficult. Words he'd heard 1,000 times, but had stopped really hearing somewhere along the way. Outside his window, the night was full of stars, cold and distant and beautiful. Caleb stared up at them, feeling small and uncertain, in a way he hadn't felt since he was young. He didn't know it yet, but his world was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. The questions Sarah had voiced, the doubts he'd been suppressing, the erosion of his certainty about right and wrong, all of it was about to come to a head in a way that would test everything he believed about himself. Tomorrow, riders would come into town with news of an Apache raid. They would bring prisoners, and among those prisoners would be a young girl whose desperate plea would shatter the armor Caleb had built around his heart and force him to choose between the man he'd become and the man his father raised him to be. But tonight, he was still just a lonely ranger in a small frontier town, reading his father's Bible by lamplight and wondering if mercy and justice could ever truly exist in the same place. The riders came thundering into Redemption Springs just after dawn, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim. Caleb was already at the sheriff's office when he heard the commotion, and he stepped outside to see what had happened. Coleman Wade was leading the group, sitting tall in his saddle with the bearing of a man who enjoyed being the center of attention. Behind him rode 6 other men, all armed, all wearing the hard expressions of people who'd seen violence. And trailing behind them, bound with rope and stumbling in the dust, were 4 Apache prisoners. 3 were men in their 20s or 30s, their faces set in defiant masks despite their obvious exhaustion. But the 4th prisoner made Caleb's stomach tighten, a girl who couldn't have been more than 16 or 17 years old. She was thin, with long dark hair that hung in tangled strands around her face, and her eyes held a kind of desperate fear that reminded him too much of a trapped animal. Sheriff Mackenzie emerged from the office, his face troubled as he surveyed the scene. A crowd was already gathering, townspeople drawn by the noise and the promise of drama. "What happened?" Mackenzie called out. Wade dismounted with theatrical flair, his voice carrying to the assembled crowd. "Apache raiders hit the Henderson place last night, killed John Henderson and his oldest boy, burned the house and ran off with their horses. We tracked them into the hills and caught these 4 trying to circle back south." A murmur ran through the crowd. Anger, fear, the kind of collective emotion that could turn dangerous quickly. Caleb moved closer, his eyes on the prisoners. The three men showed signs of fighting, cuts, bruises, torn clothing. But the girl looked untouched by combat. Her only injuries the rope burns on her wrists and the exhaustion in her face. "You're certain these are the raiders?" Mackenzie asked, his tone careful. "Found them 10 miles from the Henderson place, with fresh horses that matched the description of John's stock," Wade said confidently. "What more proof do you need?" Caleb stepped forward. "Did you see them at the Henderson place? Did they have weapons?" Wade's eyes flicked to him, and Caleb caught a flash of annoyance before the man's expression smoothed into something more diplomatic. "We didn't need to see them in the act, Stone. The evidence speaks for itself. These savages murdered 2 good men, and they need to face frontier justice." The crowd murmured its approval, and Caleb felt the temperature of the situation rising. He looked at the girl again, noting how she stood slightly apart from the 3 men, how they weren't looking at her or acknowledging her presence. "Something about the dynamic felt wrong. Take them to the jail," Mackenzie ordered. "We'll sort this out properly." "Sort it out?" A voice called from the crowd. Benjamin Cross, the banker. "What's there to sort out? We all know what they did." "We all know what needs to happen." More voices joined in, angry and demanding. Wade stood in the center of it all, not saying anything but wearing an expression of grim satisfaction. He was feeding on the crowd's anger, Caleb realized, stoking it with his silence. "There will be a proper inquiry," Mackenzie said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise. "That's the law, and that's what we'll follow. Caleb, help me get these prisoners secured." Caleb moved to comply, but as he reached for the rope binding the girl, Wade stepped between them. "The council needs to meet first. Decide on the appropriate measures. The appropriate measure is jail until we can hold a proper proceeding," Caleb said, his voice level but firm. "That's how it works." For a moment the 2 men locked eyes, and Caleb saw something cold and calculating in Wade's gaze. Then Wade smiled, that easy, charismatic smile that won him so many allies. "Of course you're right. The law must be followed. But given the severity of the crime, I think public restraint is warranted. We need to show that raiders will be held accountable, that our community won't tolerate this kind of savagery." "Public restraint?" Mackenzie frowned. "You mean chain them in the square?" Wade said, his voice carrying to the crowd. "Let everyone see that justice is coming. Let the message be clear to any other raiders who might be watching." The crowd erupted in approval, and Caleb felt the situation slipping out of control. Public chaining was a practice that had been used before, a form of humiliation and deterrence that was technically legal but deeply cruel. Prisoners would be shackled in the town square, exposed to the elements and the hostility of passing townspeople, until their trial or punishment was determined. "Marcus," Caleb said quietly, urgently. "This isn't right." "It's within the law," Mackenzie replied, his voice heavy with regret. "And the mood of the town?" He glanced at the angry faces surrounding them. "We need to keep order, Caleb. If we don't give them this, they might take matters into their own hands." It was a calculation Caleb understood but hated, choosing the lesser evil to prevent something worse. But as he looked at the girl's terrified face, at the rope burns on her thin wrists, at the way she seemed to be trying to disappear into herself, he felt something crack inside his chest. The 3 Apache men were led to the square without resistance, their faces showing neither fear nor hope, just a kind of grim acceptance. Chains were produced from the sheriff's office, heavy iron shackles that were driven into posts specially erected for this purpose. The men were secured, their hands bound, their ankles chained, leaving them able to stand or sit, but not to move more than a few feet. Then it was the girl's turn. As Caleb brought her forward, she looked up at him with those dark, desperate eyes, and she spoke in broken English, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, not with them." I not. She struggled for words, her English clearly limited. "Save your breath, girl," Wade said dismissively. "You'll have your chance to speak at the trial." But something in her plea struck Caleb with the force of a physical blow. The way she said it, the desperation in her voice, it didn't sound like someone begging for mercy from deserved punishment. It sounded like someone begging to be believed, to be seen as separate from something she wasn't part of. "Caleb," Mackenzie's voice was quiet but firm. "It has to be done." Caleb's hands shook slightly as he secured the shackles around the girl's wrists. She flinched at his touch, and he found himself murmuring, "I'm sorry," so quietly that only she could hear it. Her eyes met his again, and he saw something shift in them, a flicker of recognition that perhaps he was different from the others, that perhaps some small part of him understood. As he moved to chain her ankle, something fell from her clothing, a small beaded pouch, intricately decorated with geometric patterns in red, blue, and white. It hit the ground and spilled its contents, dried herbs, small stones, and what looked like a tiny carved figure. Wade stepped forward and crushed the pouch under his boot, grinding it into the dirt. "Apache witchcraft. We don't need that poison in our town." The girl cried out, a sound of pure anguish that had nothing to do with physical pain. She strained against her chains, reaching for the scattered contents of the pouch, but couldn't extend far enough. Tears streamed down her face, and she spoke rapidly in her own language. Words Caleb couldn't understand, but whose meaning was painfully clear. That pouch had mattered to her, had been precious. The crowd began to disperse, satisfied that justice was being served. Wade lingered, speaking with some of the townsmen about organizing watch rotations to guard the prisoners. Mackenzie returned to his office, his shoulders slumped with the weight of compromise. Caleb stood in the square, staring at the 4 chained prisoners. The 3 men had their eyes closed, their faces turned toward the morning sun in what might have been prayer. But the girl sat curled as small as she could make herself, her chains rattling as she sobbed quietly. He looked at the trampled medicine pouch, at the scattered herbs and stones that had meant something to her. And before he could stop himself, before he could think about whether it was wise or proper, he knelt down and began gathering the pieces. The girl stopped crying and watched him, her expression stunned. The beaded pouch itself was destroyed, ground into uselessness by Wade's boot. But Caleb carefully collected the herbs, the stones, the small carved figure. A tiny bird he saw now, worn smooth by handling. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, wrapped the items carefully, and then, glancing around to make sure no one was watching, moved close to the girl. "I'll keep these safe," he said quietly, meeting her eyes. "When this is over, I'll give them back to you." She stared at him, tears still tracking down her cheeks, and whispered something in her language that he didn't understand. But the tone was clear enough, gratitude mixed with disbelief that anyone would show her even this small kindness. Caleb stood up, the wrapped handkerchief heavy in his pocket, heavier than such small objects should have been. He looked at the girl one more time, at her thin frame shackled to a post in the middle of town, at the way the morning sun was already beginning to beat down on her unprotected head, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. This was wrong. Not just questionable or harsh, but fundamentally, deeply wrong. And he had been complicit in it, had been complicit in things like it for 15 years, telling himself he was just following orders, just doing his duty, just maintaining necessary order. But there came a moment in every person's life when following orders wasn't enough, when duty became an excuse rather than a justification, when maintaining order meant maintaining injustice. He walked away from the square, away from the girl's quiet sobbing and the rattle of chains, and found himself heading not back to the sheriff's office, but out of town, toward the open desert where he could breathe and think without the weight of watching eyes. The sun climbed higher, turning the air hot and thick. Birds circled overhead, and the wind carried the scent of sage and dust. Caleb walked until his legs ached, until the town was small behind him, and then he stopped and pulled the handkerchief from his pocket. He unwrapped it carefully, looking at the items he'd saved. The herbs were dried and fragrant, medicinal perhaps, or ceremonial. The stones were smooth river rocks, probably gathered from some meaningful place. And the carved bird, he turned it over in his massive hand, marveling at the delicate craftsmanship, the way it captured the essence of flight in such a small form. These were someone's treasures, Someone's connection to family, to tradition, to identity, and Wade had crushed them without a second thought, had dismissed them as witchcraft and poison, because they came from people he'd decided weren't fully human. Caleb had seen this before, the way dehumanization preceded atrocity, the way calling people savages made it easier to treat them savagely. He'd participated in it, enforced it, stood silent while it happened, and he'd told himself it was necessary, that the frontier required harsh measures, that his personal feelings didn't matter in the face of duty, but standing there in the desert heat with a dead girl's treasures in his hand, because she would die. He knew that now, whether through legal execution or mob violence, the outcome was already written. He couldn't tell himself those lies anymore. His father's voice came back to him, words from a sermon he'd heard as a boy. The test of a man's character is not how he treats those who can help him, but how he treats those who can do nothing for him. The measure of a society is not how it treats its most powerful, but how it treats its most vulnerable. The girl in the square was about as vulnerable as a human being could be, and his society was failing that measure spectacularly. Caleb rewrapped the treasures and put them back in his pocket. Then he turned and walked back toward town, his mind churning with thoughts he'd suppressed for too long. When he reached Redemption Springs, the sun was at its peak, turning the square into a furnace. The three Apache men stood stoically in their chains, their faces expressionless. But the girl had collapsed, slumped against her post, her lips cracked and her skin flushed with heat. No one had given them water. Caleb went to the well, filled a ladle, and carried it to the prisoners. He started with the men, who drank gratefully but silently. Then he knelt beside the girl, lifting her head gently. "Drink," he said softly. She opened her eyes, unfocused and confused, and then seemed to recognize him. She drank in desperate gulps, water running down her chin, and when the ladle was empty, she whispered again in broken English, "Thank you, thank you. What's your name?" Caleb asked, though he wasn't sure she would understand. She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Ayana, Ayana," he repeated, committing it to memory. Not the girl or the prisoner, but a person with a name, with an identity. "My name is Caleb." She nodded slightly, and he saw intelligence in her eyes, a sharp awareness that was evaluating him, trying to understand why he was being kind when everyone else had been cruel. "I didn't," she started, then struggled for words. "I didn't kill. I'm not with them. I was—" She made a gesture that might have meant running or escaping. "They catch me. Make me—" Another gesture, this one suggesting force or captivity. Caleb felt his chest tighten. "You were their prisoner?" She nodded vigorously. "Prisoner, long time. I try, run. They catch, bring here. Now," she rattled her chains, and a bitter, hopeless expression crossed her face. "I'll look into it," Caleb promised, though he wasn't sure what he could do. "I'll find out the truth." She studied his face, and he saw the exact moment when she decided whether to believe him or not. Then she whispered, "Please, I am begging you. Unchain me." Those words, simple, desperate, human, hit him with more force than any bullet he'd ever faced. This was the moment. This was the choice. He could walk away, tell himself he'd done what he could by giving her water and saving her treasures. He could maintain his position, his reputation, his comfortable routine. Or he could do what his father would have done, what his conscience was screaming at him to do, regardless of the cost. He stood up, his shadow falling across her like a promise or a threat. He couldn't tell which. "I'll find the truth," he said again. And then, more quietly, more like a vow, "And I'll make it right." He didn't know yet what that would require. Didn't know that keeping that promise would cost him everything he'd built his life around. But as he walked away from Ayana's desperate, hopeful eyes, the handkerchief with her treasures heavy in his pocket and her plea echoing in his mind, Caleb Stone began the transformation from a man who enforced the law to a man who would seek justice, no matter what the law said. 3 days passed, and they were the longest days of Caleb's life. Each morning, he woke before dawn and found himself unable to go through his usual routine. He would stand at his window with his coffee growing cold in his hand, staring toward the town square, where 4 people remained chained like animals on display. The weight in his chest grew heavier with each sunrise. The 3 Apache men endured their captivity with stoic dignity, their faces showing nothing to the townspeople who passed by, some curious, some sympathetic, most hostile. They spoke little, even to each other, conserving their strength and refusing to give their captors the satisfaction of seeing them suffer. But Ayana was different. She was younger, less hardened, and her fear was written plainly across her face. Caleb watched her from a distance throughout those days, saw how she flinched when people shouted insults, how she tried to make herself small when groups of men gathered nearby, how her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. He brought water 3 times a day, more than was required, more than anyone else bothered to do. Each time, he knelt beside her and spoke quietly, trying to learn more of her story through her limited English and his patient questioning. Slowly, piece by piece, a picture emerged that made his blood run cold. Ayana had been taken from her village when she was 11 years old. She didn't know the exact year. Time was measured differently in her culture, but she remembered her mother's scream, her father's futile attempt to fight off the raiders, the long, terrible journey into captivity. The men who took her had been a mixed group, some Apache from a different tribe, some Mexican bandits, some deserters from various armies. They'd moved through the borderlands like ghosts, raiding settlements and stealing what they could. She'd been passed between different groups over the years. Always the youngest, always powerless, kept alive for reasons she didn't fully understand or want to remember. She'd learned fragments of English from a captive white woman who died 2 winters ago. And those fragments were now her only way to communicate her truth. "I try run many times," she told Caleb on the 2nd day, her voice barely audible. "They catch me, hurt me. Say next time they kill. But I keep trying." "The night of the Henderson raid," Caleb pressed gently. "Where were you?" "I hide in rocks," she said, pointing vaguely eastward. 2 days before. "I get away finally, find place to hide. But I hear horses, many men. I stay quiet, but they find me anyway." Her eyes filled with tears. "I think maybe they help me. But they put rope on me, bring me here with others. No one listen when I say I'm not with them." Caleb believed her. He'd spent 15 years learning to read people, and everything about Ayana's story rang true. The way she talked about the raiders with such fear, the way she couldn't make eye contact when discussing her captivity, the way she seemed genuinely bewildered by being accused of crimes she had no part in. It all pointed to an innocent person caught in circumstances beyond her control. But belief wasn't enough. He needed evidence. On the 3rd day, Caleb rode out to the Henderson place. The ruins were still smoldering, the acrid smell of burned wood hanging in the air. He walked through the debris carefully, looking for anything that might tell him more about what had happened. The bodies had been removed for burial, but the violence of the attack was still evident. Blood on the ground, bullet holes in the walls, signs of a fierce struggle. John Henderson and his son had fought hard before they were killed. Caleb examined the tracks around the property, using skills he'd honed during the war and refined on the frontier. Multiple horses, definitely. At least 6 or 7, maybe more. He found shell casings from various weapons, old army rifles, newer models, even a shotgun blast pattern in one of the walls. What he didn't find was anything that connected Ayana to this place. No small footprints, no evidence of a young woman's presence. The tracks of the raiders led northeast, which was consistent with Wade's story. But there were also tracks leading southeast, older ones that had been partially obscured by the main group. He followed the southeast tracks for several miles, until he found what he was looking for, a small hollow in the rocks where someone had clearly sheltered for at least a day or 2. There were signs of a small fire, carefully concealed. Some disturbed earth where someone had slept. And most tellingly, several long dark hairs caught on a rough stone edge. This was where Ayana had hidden. He was certain of it, and the timeline didn't match Wade's story. These tracks were at least 2 days older than the raid, maybe 3, which meant Ayana had been here, alone and in hiding, when the Henderson place was attacked. Caleb collected the hairs carefully, wrapping them in another handkerchief. It wasn't much, but it was something. Physical evidence that supported Ayanna's version of events. When he returned to town that evening, he went straight to the sheriff's office. Mackenzie was there, going through wanted posters with the weary expression of a man who'd seen too many faces that all started to blur together. "Marcus, we need to talk about the Apache prisoners," Caleb said. Closing the door behind him, the sheriff looked up, his eyes showing resignation more than surprise. "I wondered when you'd come to me about this." "The girl is innocent," Caleb said flatly. "I've been investigating, and her story holds up. She wasn't part of the raid. She was a captive trying to escape." Mackenzie set down the posters and removed his spectacles, rubbing his eyes. "What evidence do you have?" Caleb laid out what he'd found, the hiding place, the tracks, the timeline that didn't match. He explained the conversations he'd had with Ayanna, the details that rang true. Mackenzie listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled. "That's not enough," the sheriff said finally. "Not to overturn Wade's testimony and the council's decision. Then what would be enough?" Caleb demanded, frustration bleeding into his voice. "What would it take to convince people that we've chained an innocent girl in the square like an animal?" "Proof that would stand up in court," Mackenzie said. "Witnesses, corroboration from the other prisoners, maybe. Something more concrete than tracks and timing." "The other prisoners don't acknowledge her," Caleb pointed out. "They've barely looked at her since they've been here. Doesn't that strike you as odd?" "It strikes me as Apache not wanting to talk to white lawmen," Mackenzie countered. "You know how they are." Caleb bit back his anger, recognizing that losing his temper wouldn't help Ayanna. "Then let me question them properly. Let me investigate this thoroughly before we proceed with any punishment." Mackenzie stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening street. "The council meets tomorrow night. Wade's pushing for immediate sentencing, death by hanging for the 3 men, imprisonment for the girl as a warning to others." "That's insane," Caleb said. "Even if they were guilty, execution without a proper trial. This is the frontier, Caleb. Proper trials are a luxury we can't always afford." The sheriff's voice was heavy with regret. "And the town is angry. They want blood for blood. If we don't give them some measure of justice, they'll take it themselves." "That's not justice," Caleb said quietly. "That's revenge. And we're better than that. We have to be." Mackenzie turned to face him, and in the lamplight he looked every one of his 60-some years. "I used to think so. When I first came to this territory, I believed we were bringing civilization, law, order. But sometimes I wonder if we're just bringing different kinds of savagery." The admission hung in the air between them, the kind of honest doubt that men like them rarely voiced. "Help me prove her innocence," Caleb said. "Give me until the council meeting tomorrow. Let me do this right. And if you can't prove it?" Mackenzie asked. "What then?" Caleb didn't have an answer to that. He couldn't imagine standing by while Ayanna was executed or imprisoned for crimes she didn't commit. But he also didn't know what he could do to prevent it if the town had already made up its mind. That night, unable to sleep, Caleb found himself going through his personal belongings. He pulled out the box he kept under his bed, the one containing memories from his old life. The tin-type photograph of Mary and Emma, a letter Mary had written him during the war, creased and faded from being read too many times. A small book of poetry she'd loved, and at the bottom of the box, wrapped in cloth, the wooden horse he'd carved for Emma. He took it out and held it in his hands, remembering how her face had lit up when he'd given it to her. She'd named it Thunder and had insisted it sleep beside her bed every night. After she died, finding this among her things had nearly broken him all over again. He'd kept it as a reminder of what he'd lost, of what mattered, of the life he'd failed to protect. But looking at it now, he realized it was also a reminder of who he'd been before grief and war had hardened him. A father who made toys for his daughter. A husband who wrote love letters. A man who believed in gentleness and hope. That man had been buried for a long time. But maybe he wasn't dead. Maybe he'd just been waiting for a reason to come back to life. Caleb thought about Ayanna, chained in the square, young enough to be his daughter, desperate enough to beg a stranger for help. He thought about the medicine pouch he'd saved, the treasures that connected her to family and identity. He thought about her voice saying, "I am begging you, unchain me." And he realized that some part of him had already made a decision, even if his conscious mind hadn't caught up yet. He was going to save her. Not because it was easy or safe or smart, but because it was right. Because his father had raised him to believe that every human life had dignity and value. Because his daughter would have wanted him to be the kind of man who helped scared young girls, not the kind who stood by while they suffered. The cost didn't matter. His reputation, his position, his comfortable routine, none of it mattered compared to doing what his conscience demanded. He wrapped the wooden horse back in its cloth and put it away, but kept the photograph of Mary and Emma on his table. He wanted them to see what he was about to do, wanted them to know that he was finally remembering how to be the man they'd believed him to be. The next morning, Caleb went to the square early, before most of the town was awake. Ayanna was dozing fitfully, her head resting against the post she was chained to. In sleep, she looked even younger, vulnerable in a way that made his chest ache. He knelt beside her with water and some bread he'd brought from his cabin. She woke at his approach, instinctively flinching before she recognized him. Then her expression softened into something like trust. "Caleb," she said quietly, accepting the water. "I've been investigating your story," he told her as she ate. "I believe you. I've found where you were hiding, and I know you weren't part of the raid." Hope flared in her eyes, so bright and desperate it hurt to see. "You tell them? You make them?" She gestured at her chains. "I'm trying," he said, "but it's complicated. The town wants someone to punish for what happened. They're not interested in listening to evidence that goes against what they've already decided." The hope dimmed, replaced by resignation. She'd probably known this would be the outcome all along. "They kill me," she said flatly. "Like they kill others." "No," Caleb said firmly. "I won't let that happen." She looked at him with such searching intensity, trying to determine if this was a promise he could keep or just empty comfort. "Why, you help me. You not know me." "I am," she struggled for the word. "I am enemy to your people." "You're not my enemy," Caleb said. "You're a young woman who's been hurt and scared for too long. And that's all that matters." Tears welled in her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. "My mother say that too, before they take me. She say I'm not bad, I'm just girl. But no one see that now. Everyone see only Apache, only enemy. I see you, Ayanna," Caleb said quietly. "I see exactly who you are." She reached out then, her chained hand moving as far as the shackles would allow, and touched his arm briefly. It was the smallest gesture, but it carried the weight of all her gratitude, all her desperate hope that maybe, somehow, this stranger would be different from all the others who'd failed her. Caleb stood up, aware that people were starting to emerge from their homes, that being seen having long conversations with the prisoners would raise questions he wasn't ready to answer. But before he left, he made her a promise that he intended to keep, no matter what it cost him. "There's a council meeting tonight. They're going to decide what happens to you and the others. I'm going to present the evidence of your innocence. And if they won't listen," he paused, meeting her eyes. "If they won't listen, then I'll find another way. I give you my word." "Your word," she repeated softly, testing the phrase. Then, with something that might have been the beginning of a smile, "Thank you, Caleb Stone. Your word is good thing." I think, as he walked away from the square, he caught sight of Sarah Brennan sweeping the boardwalk in front of her store. She was watching him, had probably been watching the whole interaction. When their eyes met, she nodded slightly, a gesture of approval or perhaps solidarity. She understood what he was trying to do, and she approved. That knowledge gave him strength as he prepared for the battle ahead. The council meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock that evening. Caleb had hours to prepare his case, to gather his evidence, to find the right words that might convince hard-hearted men to choose mercy over vengeance. But as the day wore on, and he saw the mood of the town, the clusters of men talking angrily at the saloon, the women whispering behind their hands. Coleman Wade, moving through the streets like a politician courting votes, Caleb began to understand that facts and evidence might not be enough. Some minds were already made up. Some hearts were already hardened. And some men, like Wade, had their own reasons for wanting things to go a certain way. Reasons that had nothing to do with justice. The sun set in streaks of red and gold, and Caleb stood in his cabin, the wooden horse in one hand and his badge in the other. Two symbols of who he was, or who he'd been. A father who'd failed to protect his child. A lawman who'd enforced unjust rules for too long. Tonight, he would find out which of those identities was stronger. Tonight, he would either save an innocent girl or lose the last shreds of faith he had in himself. He pinned the badge over his heart and left the wooden horse on his table where Mary and Emma's photograph could watch over it. Then he walked toward the church where the council meeting would be held, ready to fight for Ayana's life with every tool he had. And if words and evidence weren't enough, then he would find other tools. Because a promise made to a desperate girl in chains was sacred in a way that badges and positions could never be. The church was packed when Caleb arrived. Every seat was filled, and people lined the walls, their faces reflecting the lamplight in harsh angles and deep shadows. The air was thick with tension and the smell of too many bodies in too small a space. The 5 council members sat at a table at the front: Reverend Hartwell, Doc Morrison, Samuel Tucker, Benjamin Cross, and Coleman Wade. Wade had positioned himself in the center, Caleb noticed, though technically the Reverend should have occupied that place as council chair. Sheriff Mackenzie stood to one side, his expression carefully neutral. When Caleb entered, their eyes met briefly, and the older man gave the smallest nod of acknowledgement. "Let's begin," Wade said, not waiting for the Reverend to call the meeting to order. "We're here to discuss the punishment for the Apache raiders who murdered John Henderson and his son. The evidence is clear, the crime is heinous, and justice must be swift." "Perhaps we should hear from Ranger Stone first," Reverend Hartwell suggested mildly. "I understand he's been investigating the circumstances." Wade's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "By all means, though I'm not sure what there is to investigate. We caught the raiders with stolen horses. The case is straightforward." Caleb stepped forward, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "I've spent the past 3 days examining the evidence, and I've found several inconsistencies that need to be addressed before we proceed with any punishment." A murmur ran through the crowd, part interest, part annoyance. Caleb pressed on. "First, regarding the girl, Ayana, I've questioned her extensively, and her story is that she was not part of the raiding party. She claims she was being held captive by the 3 men and had escaped 2 days before the Henderson raid occurred." "Of course she'd claim that," someone called from the back. "What else would she say?" "I found physical evidence supporting her account," Caleb continued, refusing to be derailed. "There's a hiding place approximately 8 miles southeast of the Henderson Ranch, showing signs that someone camped there for 2 to 3 days before the raid. The timing and location match her story exactly." "Circumstantial evidence," Wade interjected smoothly. "A hiding place could belong to anyone. It doesn't prove the girl is innocent. It proves she wasn't with the raiding party when the attack occurred," Caleb countered. "And there's more. I've observed the behavior of the 3 Apache men since their capture. They don't acknowledge the girl. They don't speak to her or look at her. Their body language suggests they don't consider her part of their group." Doc Morrison leaned forward, his weathered face thoughtful. "That is peculiar, I'll grant you. In my experience, people who commit crimes together usually show some connection, some awareness of each other." "She could have been a lookout," Benjamin Cross suggested. "Sent ahead to scout while the men did the actual raiding, at 11 years old." Caleb asked sharply, "Because that's how old she was when she was taken from her village. She's been a captive for 6 years, passed between different groups of raiders. She has scars on her wrists and ankles from being bound repeatedly. This isn't speculation. These are facts I've verified through observation and questioning." The room fell quieter as people absorbed this information. Caleb saw several faces showing doubt, reconsidering their certainty. But he also saw others hardening further, unwilling to let sympathy interfere with their desire for retribution. Wade stood up, his voice taking on a tone of reasonable authority. Ranger Stone's compassion is admirable, but let's not lose sight of what we know for certain. 4 Apache were found with stolen horses near the site of a brutal murder. Whether the girl was a full participant or merely an accomplice is ultimately irrelevant. The law requires that raiders be punished to deter future attacks. The law requires that justice be served, Caleb shot back. And there's no justice in punishing someone for crimes they didn't commit. Gentlemen, please. Reverend Hartwell raised his hands. This is becoming heated. Perhaps we should hear from the prisoners themselves. Have the 3 men been questioned about the girl's involvement? They refuse to speak, Mackenzie said from his position along the wall. I've tried questioning them multiple times. They won't say a word, not in English or in their own language. They just stare straight ahead like stone. Typical Apache stubbornness, Tucker muttered. Can't get a straight answer out of them to save their lives. Which, ironically, they can't. A few people laughed at that, an ugly sound that made Caleb's skin crawl. What about witnesses? Doc Morrison asked. Does anyone actually place these prisoners at the Henderson Ranch during the attack? The timing and location are proof enough, Wade insisted. They were found within striking distance of the ranch with Henderson's horses. What more do we need? We need to be certain, Caleb said firmly. We need to know beyond doubt that we're executing the right people. Because once it's done, it can't be undone. And if we're wrong, he paused, making sure everyone was listening. If we're wrong, then we're no better than the murderers we claim to be punishing. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. These were people who believed in clear lines between right and wrong, who needed to see themselves as civilized in contrast to the savage Apache. Caleb's words challenged that comfortable narrative. I've heard enough, Wade said abruptly. We can debate philosophy all night, but the facts remain unchanged. The council needs to vote on appropriate punishment. I move that the 3 Apache men be hanged at dawn tomorrow for murder, and that the girl be imprisoned for 10 years as an accessory to murder and a warning to other potential raiders. That's not, Caleb started. I second the motion, Cross interrupted. Reverend Hartwell looked troubled. Shouldn't we take more time to consider Ranger Stone's evidence? What evidence? Wade spread his hands. Some tracks that might belong to anyone. Speculation about the relationships between prisoners. The Ranger's gut feeling that the girl is innocent. That's not evidence, that's sentiment. And sentiment has no place in frontier justice. I agree with Wade, Tucker said. We've been too soft on Apache raids for too long. It's time to send a strong message. Doc Morrison hesitated, his eyes moving between Caleb and Wade. I'm not entirely comfortable with this rush to judgment. Then you're putting sentiment above safety, Wade cut in. The longer we delay, the more we look weak, and weakness invites more attacks. The doctor's face flushed at the implicit accusation of cowardice, and Caleb saw him wavering. This was how Wade operated, pushing, manipulating, using people's fears and pride to get what he wanted. Wait, Caleb said, his voice carrying across the room. Before you vote, I want everyone to understand what we're really deciding here. We're not just determining punishment for criminals. We're deciding whether to kill a girl who may be completely innocent. A girl who's already suffered years of captivity and abuse. A girl who has no one to speak for her except me. He turned to face the crowd, meeting as many eyes as he could. I've been a ranger for 15 years. I've tracked raiders, made arrests, stood witness at executions. I've never questioned my duty before, but I'm questioning it now because I've looked into that girl's eyes and I've seen nothing but fear and desperation. Not guilt, not defiance, just a terrified child begging for mercy. She's not a child, Wade said coldly. She's Apache. And out here, Apache grow up fast, or they don't grow up at all. She's 17 years old, Caleb said quietly. The same age my daughter would have been if she'd lived. And I know in my bones that she's innocent. Maybe I can't prove it to everyone's satisfaction. Maybe the evidence isn't perfect. But I know. Sarah Brennan spoke up from where she'd been standing quietly near the back. I believe him. Caleb Stone is the most honest man in this town. If he says the girl is innocent, then she deserves the benefit of the doubt. Thank you, Mrs. Brennan, Wade said with exaggerated courtesy. But this is a matter for the council to decide, not for— He paused delicately. Not for those governed by emotion rather than reason. The dismissal was clear, and Sarah's face colored with anger. But before she could respond, Mackenzie stepped forward. I've known Caleb Stone for 15 years, the sheriff said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. In all that time, I've never seen him shirk his duty or let personal feelings interfere with his judgment. If he says there's reasonable doubt about the girl's guilt, then I believe we have an obligation to investigate further before proceeding with irreversible punishment. Wade's expression tightened. Sheriff, with all due respect, your sentimentality is showing. Perhaps age is making you soft. The insult landed hard, and Mackenzie's face went rigid. Around the room, people shifted uncomfortably. Wade had gone too far, questioned the sheriff's competence too directly. But Wade seemed to recognize his mistake and quickly smoothed it over. I apologize. That was uncalled for. I'm simply concerned that we're letting sympathy cloud our judgment. The safety of this community must come first. The honor of this community should come first, Reverend Hartwell said quietly. And there's no honor in executing people we're not certain are guilty, so you're voting against the motion. Wade asked sharply. The Reverend hesitated, and Caleb could see the conflict in his face, the struggle between compassion and the pressure to conform, between his religious principles and the expectations of his congregation. I need more time to pray on it, Hartwell said finally, and Caleb's heart sank. That was effectively a capitulation, a way to avoid taking a stand. We don't have time, Wade pressed. Every day those prisoners sit in our square, we look weak and indecisive. We need to act now, tonight. I call for a vote. All in favor of executing the 3 Apache men and imprisoning the girl? Wade asked, raising his own hand immediately. Cross's hand went up without hesitation. Tucker followed after only a brief pause. Doc Morrison looked at Caleb one more time, his expression apologetic, and then slowly raised his hand. 3 votes. It was done. Reverend Hartwell sat with his hands folded, not voting either way, his face showing the shame of someone who'd failed to stand up for what he believed. The motion passes, Wade said with satisfaction. Execution will be carried out at dawn. Sheriff Mackenzie, please make the necessary arrangements. Mackenzie's face was carved from stone. And the girl? She'll be transported to the territorial prison after the executions, Wade said. As a lesson that mercy has its limits. The crowd began to disperse, most people looking satisfied that justice had been served. A few looked troubled, but not troubled enough to speak up. Caleb stood frozen in place, watching his worst fear become reality. Sarah appeared at his side, her hand touching his arm. I'm sorry, she said quietly. You tried. Trying isn't enough, Caleb said, his voice rough. She's going to die in that prison. 17 years old, and she'll spend the rest of her life locked in a cell for crimes she didn't commit. What are you going to do? It was the question that had been building in his mind throughout the meeting, the question he'd been trying to avoid because he already knew the answer. I'm going to keep my promise to her. Sarah's eyes widened. Caleb, you can't mean I gave her my word, he said simply. That's all I have left that matters. He left the church without another word, walking through the darkened streets toward the square. Ayana was awake, had probably been awake the whole time, wondering what the council would decide. When she saw him approaching, she stood up as much as her chains allowed, her face desperately hopeful. Caleb, she asked, her voice small in the darkness. He knelt in front of her, his massive frame level with her slight one, and spoke the truth because he owed her that much. The council voted to execute the 3 men at dawn, and to send you to prison for 10 years. He watched hope die in her eyes, watched her face crumple with despair. She sank down against the post, chains rattling, and made a sound that wasn't quite a sob, something deeper and more broken. I'm sorry, he said. I tried to convince them. I showed them the evidence, but they wouldn't listen. She didn't respond, just sat there with her head bowed, and Caleb felt something inside him twist and tear. This wasn't justice. This wasn't honor. This was cowardice masquerading as strength, fear disguised as righteousness. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the handkerchief containing her treasures, the herbs, the stones, the carved bird. He pressed it into her chained hands. "I'm giving these back to you now," he said quietly, "because I'm keeping my other promise. I'm getting you out of here." Her head snapped up, eyes wide. "What?" "Tomorrow night, after the executions, there will be chaos and grief. Everyone will be distracted. I'm going to unchain you, and we're going to leave this town. I know a place, an Apache settlement where peaceful families live. I'll take you there, get you back to your people. They catch you," she whispered. "They punish you." "Probably," he agreed. "But that doesn't matter. What matters is that you don't spend the rest of your life in a cell for something you didn't do." "Why?" she asked, and there were tears streaming down her face now. "Why you do this? You lose everything." Caleb thought about his daughter, about the wooden horse on his table, about the man his father had tried to raise him to be. "Because it's right. Because someone needs to stand up for you. Because—" he paused, finding words for something he'd barely admitted to himself. "Because I have a daughter who I couldn't protect. And maybe, in some small way, saving you honors her memory." Ayana reached out and took his hand, her fingers small and cold in his large, warm palm. "Your daughter, she would be proud of you." "I hope so," Caleb said quietly. "I really hope so." He stood up, his decision made and his course set. "Be ready tomorrow night. When I come for you, we'll need to move fast." "I am ready now," she said fiercely. "I am ready since 6 years." Caleb walked away from the square, his badge feeling heavier than it ever had. He went to his cabin and sat at his table, looking at Mary and Emma's photograph in the lamplight. "I don't know if you can see me," he said to their faces, "but I need you to understand why I'm doing this. I need you to know that I'm finally remembering what you taught me, that being good is more important than being comfortable, that standing up for someone who can't stand up for themselves is worth any cost." The photograph didn't answer, but in the flickering lamplight, Mary's smile seemed approving, and Emma's eyes seemed proud. Tomorrow 3 men would die. It was too late to save them, though Caleb suspected they might be guilty of other crimes, even if not the Henderson murders. But Ayana was different. She was innocent and young and deserving of a chance at life, and he was going to give her that chance, even if it meant throwing away everything he'd built over 15 years. Even if it meant becoming an outlaw himself. Even if it meant he could never come back to this town or pin on his badge again. Some things were worth more than security. Some promises were worth more than safety. And some girls in chains deserved to be free, regardless of what the law said. Caleb Stone had spent 15 years enforcing other people's ideas of justice. Tomorrow night, he would finally enforce his own. Dawn came too quickly, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Caleb stood at his window watching the sunrise, knowing what it would bring. The executions were scheduled for 7 o'clock, giving people time to gather and witness what Coleman Wade called frontier justice. He'd barely slept, spending the night planning Ayana's escape with the methodical precision of a military operation. Every detail mattered. Every contingency needed to be considered. One mistake, one overlooked element, and they'd both end up dead or imprisoned. The first thing he needed was a map. He went to the sheriff's office before anyone else arrived, letting himself in with the key Mackenzie had given him years ago. The office was dim and quiet, smelling of old coffee and leather. On the wall behind Mackenzie's desk hung a large territorial map, marked with settlements, water sources, known Apache territories, and danger zones. Caleb studied it carefully, memorizing the routes that would take them east toward the peaceful Apache settlement he'd heard about, a group that had accepted government terms and lived on designated land, farming and trying to maintain their traditions within the constraints of the new order. It was about a 3-day ride if they pushed hard. They'd need to avoid the main trails, stay away from ranches and towns, travel mostly at night. Water would be the biggest challenge. There were only a few reliable sources along the route, And they'd have to plan carefully to avoid dying of thirst in the desert. He pulled out a piece of paper and began sketching his own rough map, marking the landmarks he'd need to navigate by. Distinctive rock formations, dry creek beds that filled during storms, an abandoned line shack where they could shelter if necessary. Planning a trip? Caleb spun around to find Sheriff Mackenzie standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the early morning light. "Marcus," Caleb said carefully, "I didn't hear you come in." "I gathered that," the sheriff said, closing the door behind him. He walked to his desk and sat down heavily, gesturing for Caleb to take the chair across from him. "I've been doing this job for 23 years. You learned to read people in that time. And right now, I'm reading a man who's about to do something that will end his career and possibly his life." Caleb said nothing, waiting. "The girl," Mackenzie continued. "You're planning to free her." It wasn't a question, so Caleb didn't deny it. "She's innocent, Marcus. You know it as well as I do. Innocent or not, the council has spoken." The law is wrong," Caleb interrupted. "And you know that too. You stood up for me last night at the meeting. You believed me." Mackenzie removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes, looking older and more tired than Caleb had ever seen him. "Believing and acting are different things. I have responsibilities, Caleb, to this town, to my position. I can't just turn a blind eye to injustice." Caleb finished. "That's all I'm asking. Just don't see what you don't need to see." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I have grandchildren in Kansas. I was planning to retire next year. Go back east and spend my last years being useful to my family, instead of uselessly trying to civilize a wilderness that doesn't want to be civilized. Then go with a clear conscience," Caleb said. "Let this be your last act of real justice instead of just law enforcement." Mackenzie stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the town beginning to wake. "If I help you, even by doing nothing, I'm betraying everything I've stood for. If you don't help me, you're betraying everything you've believed in," Caleb countered. "There's a difference between standing for something and just standing in place." The sheriff laughed, a short, bitter sound. "When did you get so philosophical?" "When I looked into that girl's eyes and saw my dead daughter looking back at me," Caleb said honestly. "When I realized that I've spent 15 years hiding from grief instead of honoring it. When I understood that the only way to live with myself going forward is to do what's right, regardless of the cost." Mackenzie turned back to face him, and something had shifted in his expression. "The map on the wall is old, outdated, doesn't show the new water sources that were discovered last spring. The locations are in my journal, the brown leather one, second drawer of my desk. Anyone planning a route east would need that information to survive." Caleb's heart quickened. "Marcus!" "I'm going to the hotel for breakfast," the sheriff said, speaking over him. "I'll be gone for at least an hour, maybe longer. When I get back, I expect that map to still be on my wall and my office to be exactly as I left it." He paused at the door. "After the executions tonight, I expect there will be chaos. People grieving, emotions running high. I imagine the prisoners in the square will be the last thing on anyone's mind for at least a few hours." "Thank you," Caleb said quietly. "Don't thank me," Mackenzie said, his voice rough with emotion. "Just make sure that girl survives. Make sure this act of rebellion means something. Because if you fail, I'll have betrayed everything for nothing. And I'll have to live with that for whatever years I have left." He left without another word. And Caleb sat alone in the office, overwhelmed by the enormity of what was unfolding. He wasn't just risking his own life anymore. He was asking Mackenzie to risk his reputation, his retirement, everything he'd built over 2 decades. But the sheriff had chosen to help anyway, had chosen conscience over comfort. And that gave Caleb hope that maybe, just maybe, there were still enough good people in the world to make fighting for justice worthwhile. He opened the second drawer and found the brown leather journal. Inside, in Mackenzie's precise handwriting, were detailed notes about the territory. New springs discovered, seasonal water sources, safe camping spots, places to avoid. Caleb copied the relevant information onto his rough map. adding the details that might mean the difference between life and death in the desert. When he finished, he put the journal back exactly where he'd found it and left the office. His mind already moving to the next challenge. Supplies, he couldn't gather them himself without raising suspicion. But he knew someone who could. Sarah Brennan was opening her store when he arrived, and she smiled when she saw him approaching. But the smile faded when she saw his expression. "Something's wrong," she said, ushering him inside quickly. "What is it?" "I need your help," Caleb said. "And I need you to understand that helping me could put you in danger." She closed the door and locked it, then turned to face him with her arms crossed. "Tell me what you need." He laid it out as simply as he could, his plan to free Ayana, the route they'd take, the supplies required. As he spoke, Sarah's expression shifted from shock to concern, to something that might have been admiration. "You're really going to do this?" she said when he finished. "You're throwing away everything." "I'm not throwing anything away," Caleb corrected gently. "I'm choosing what matters over what's comfortable." "There's a difference." Sarah nodded slowly, then moved through her store with purpose, pulling items from shelves and gathering them into a pile. "You'll need dried beef, hardtack beans, water canteens, at least 4, blankets because the nights are cold, medical supplies in case either of you is injured, matches, a knife, ammunition for your rifle. Sarah, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking," she said firmly. "I'm giving. There's a difference, as you just told me." She paused in her gathering and looked at him directly. "Caleb, I lost my daughter 6 years ago. Every day since then, I've regretted that I wasn't strong enough to save her, that I couldn't do more to fight the fever that took her. I know that's not rational. There was nothing I could do. But the guilt doesn't care about rational." She moved closer, her voice softening. "What you're doing, saving this girl, standing up for what's right even when it costs you everything, that's the kind of strength I wish I'd had. That's the kind of courage that makes life worth living. So let me help. Let me be part of something good." Caleb felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you," he managed. "Don't thank me yet," she said with a slight smile. "Thank me when you and Ayana are safely with her people. And this nightmare is behind you." She continued gathering supplies, and Caleb helped her pack everything into saddlebags that could be easily thrown onto a horse. As they worked, Sarah asked, "What will you do after? After you deliver her to safety?" Caleb had been trying not to think about that. "I don't know. I can't come back here. Can't be a ranger anymore. Maybe I'll head further west, or north to Montana. Find a place where no one knows me and start over." "That sounds lonely," Sarah observed quietly. "I've been lonely for 15 years, Caleb admitted. "At least this way, I'll be lonely with a clear conscience." Sarah set down the blanket she'd been folding and turned to face him fully. "For what it's worth, I think you're the bravest man I've ever met. And I hope—" She hesitated, then continued, "I hope that wherever you end up, you find peace." "You deserve it. So do you," Caleb said sincerely. "This town is lucky to have you." "This town doesn't deserve me," she said with a hint of bitterness. "Doesn't deserve you either. But that's the thing about good people. They keep trying to make bad situations better, even when it's hopeless." They finished packing the supplies, and Sarah helped him hide the saddlebags in the back room where they wouldn't be noticed. "I'll keep these until tonight," she said. After everything, I'll bring them to your cabin. You can collect them there." Caleb nodded, then did something impulsive. He pulled Sarah into a brief embrace, feeling her stiffen with surprise before relaxing and hugging him back. "Thank you," he said again, meaning it more deeply than words could convey. "For everything. For believing in me. For helping Ayana. For reminding me that there are still good people in the world." "You're one of them, Caleb," she said softly. "Don't forget that." He left the store and spent the rest of the morning preparing in quieter ways. He checked his rifle, made sure his revolver was fully loaded, packed a few personal items he couldn't bear to leave behind: Mary and Emma's photograph, his father's Bible, the wooden horse. They fit in a small leather bag that he could carry easily. By noon, the town square was filling with people. The gallows had been erected overnight, a grim scaffold that cast long shadows across the square. The 3 Apache men were brought from the jail. their faces impassive as they were led toward their deaths. Ayana watched from her post, her eyes wide with horror. She'd been forced to witness the execution of her captors, men who'd hurt her, but who were still the only faces she'd known for 6 years. The complexity of her emotions was written plainly across her face. Relief, guilt, fear, and a deep, aching sadness for the waste of it all. Caleb stood at the edge of the crowd, unable to look away despite wanting to. Coleman Wade stood prominently near the gallows, giving a speech about frontier justice and the importance of strength in the face of savagery. His words washed over Caleb like meaningless noise. The executions were swift and brutal. 3 ropes, 3 bodies, 3 lives extinguished to satisfy the town's need for retribution. When it was over, the crowd dispersed slowly. Some people looking satisfied, others troubled. Most just relieved it was finished. Caleb watched Ayana slump against her post. Her eyes closed, tears streaming down her face. She was murmuring something in her own language, a prayer perhaps, or a farewell to the men who'd been both her captors and the closest thing she'd had to companions for years. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, and the town gradually returned to normal routines. People went about their business, the executions already fading into the background of daily life. Caleb returned to his cabin as evening approached. Sarah arrived shortly after with the saddlebags of supplies, handing them over without a word. Her eyes were red-rimmed, suggesting she'd been crying, but her jaw was set with determination. "The town will be at the saloon tonight," she said. "Wade's buying drinks, celebrating the victory of justice. Most people will be there or at home. The square should be mostly empty by 9 o'clock. "You've thought this through," Caleb observed. "I'm invested now," she said. "Might as well make sure you have the best chance of success." She paused, then added, "There's a horse at the livery, a mare named Silver. She's fast and sure-footed, good for desert travel. I've already paid the stable hand to have her saddled and ready. He thinks I'm lending her to a traveler passing through." "Sarah, go," she said firmly. "Save that girl, and save yourself. This town doesn't deserve either of you." She left before he could say anything more, and Caleb was alone with his preparations and his thoughts. He changed into dark clothes that wouldn't show easily at night, strapped on his gun belt, and slung his rifle across his back. The saddlebags went over his shoulder, heavy with supplies and hope. At 8:30, he slipped out of his cabin and made his way through the darkening streets. The sounds of music and laughter drifted from the saloon, where Wade's celebration was in full swing. Most houses were lit from within, families settling in for the evening. The square was empty, except for Ayana, still chained to her post, her head bowed with exhaustion. Caleb approached silently, his heart hammering against his ribs. When his shadow fell across her, she looked up, and her eyes widened with recognition and desperate hope. "It's time," Caleb whispered, pulling out the bolt cutters he'd borrowed from the blacksmith's shop. "We're leaving. Now?" she whispered back. They're all at the saloon," he assured her, "and the ones who aren't won't stop us. I promise." He cut through the chains binding her wrists first, the metal giving way with a sharp crack that seemed terrifyingly loud in the quiet square. Then her ankles, freeing her completely for the first time in days. Ayana stood on shaky legs, rubbing her raw wrists, and looked at Caleb with an expression of pure gratitude mixed with disbelief. "You came. You keep promise?" "I always keep my promises," Caleb said simply. He handed her a canteen. "Drink. Then we need to move." She drank deeply, and some color returned to her pale face. Then she straightened her shoulders, and despite everything she'd endured, Caleb saw strength in her bearing, the resilience of someone who'd survived 6 years of captivity and refused to be broken. "I am ready," she said firmly. "Where we go?" "To your people," Caleb told her. "To freedom. To home." And together, the aging ranger and the young Apache girl slipped into the darkness beyond the town's edge, leaving behind the chains that had bound them both, hers of iron, his of duty, and heading toward an uncertain future that held the promise of redemption. They moved quickly through the darkness, staying off the main trail and following the route Caleb had memorized from Mackenzie's map. Copper and the mare Sarah had arranged, Silver, were waiting at a small clearing beyond the town's edge, exactly where they'd been positioned. Caleb lifted Ayana onto Silver's back, noting how light she was, how the days of captivity had wasted what little flesh she'd had. "You know how to ride?" he asked, mounting Copper. "My father teach me," she said, settling into the saddle with surprising ease. "Long time ago." Before, she didn't finish, but she didn't need to. They rode hard for the first 2 hours, putting as much distance between themselves and Redemption Springs as possible. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate by, turning the desert landscape into a study of silver and shadow. Caleb kept checking behind them, watching for pursuit. But the night remained quiet, except for the steady rhythm of hooves and the occasional cry of a night bird. When they reached a rocky outcropping that provided some cover, Caleb called a halt. Both horses were breathing hard, their flanks dark with sweat. "We rest here for a bit," he said, dismounting and helping Ayana down. "Let the horses recover. We've got a long way to go." Ayana stood on wobbling legs, her face pale in the moonlight. Now that the immediate danger had passed and the adrenaline was fading, the full extent of her exhaustion was becoming apparent. She swayed slightly, and Caleb caught her arm to steady her. "When did you last eat?" he asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. "They give little food," she admitted. "Bread, water? Not much." Caleb dug into the saddlebags and pulled out dried beef and hardtack. Ayana ate slowly at first, then with increasing hunger, as if her body was suddenly remembering what it needed. He gave her more water, watching to make sure she didn't drink too fast and make herself sick. While she ate, Caleb stood watch, his eyes scanning the darkness behind them. No signs of pursuit yet, but it would come. When someone noticed Ayana was missing, probably when they came to transport her to prison in the morning, Wade would organize a hunting party. And Wade struck Caleb as the type of man who wouldn't give up easily. "Caleb," Ayana's voice was quiet. "Why you have picture of woman and child?" He turned to see her holding the photograph he'd packed in his leather bag. Must have fallen out when he'd retrieved the food. For a moment, he considered taking it back without answering, maintaining the distance that kept grief at bay. But something about the desert night and the enormity of what they'd just done made secrets seem pointless. "My wife and daughter," he said, settling down beside her. "Mary and Emma. They died 15 years ago while I was off fighting in the war. Viva took them both within a week of each other." Ayana studied the photograph with careful attention, her fingers tracing the figures gently. "They are beautiful." "Your daughter, she looked like you. Same eyes." Caleb had never noticed that before, but looking at the photograph now, he saw she was right. Emma had inherited his eyes, grey like winter skies. The realization brought a fresh wave of grief and something else, gratitude that at least part of him had lived on in her, however briefly. "She would have been about your age now," he said quietly. 17. I think about that sometimes, who she would have become, what kind of person she'd be, whether she'd be proud of her father or disappointed in what he became. Ayana handed the photograph back carefully. "She'd be proud. You saved me. You break the chains. That is brave thing, good thing. I should have broken them sooner," Caleb said, the guilt he'd been carrying finally finding words. "Should have questioned what I was doing years ago. Should have stood up the first time I saw injustice instead of waiting until—" He gestured at the two of them sitting in the desert darkness, fugitives from the law he'd once sworn to uphold. "My grandmother say something," Ayana offered, her English becoming more comfortable as she relaxed. "She say tree that bends in storm survives. Tree that is too hard, it breaks. You bend when you need to. That is not weakness. That is wisdom. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She is." Ayana's face brightened with hope. "You think she's still alive? You think I find her?" "That's what we're going to do," Caleb assured her. "The settlement we're heading to, it's where peaceful Apache families live. If she's anywhere, she'll be there. And if she's not—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If she's not, then we'll keep looking until we find her or find out what happened to her." "I promise you that. You make many promises," Ayana observed. To me, to yourself, to your dead family. That is heavy burden. Keeping them is lighter than breaking them, Caleb said simply. They rested for another hour, both of them dozing fitfully, while the horses cropped at the sparse desert grass. When Caleb judged the animals had recovered enough, he woke Ayana gently, and they mounted again. The second leg of their journey took them through rougher terrain. Rocky hills that made the horses pick their way carefully, dry creek beds that twisted and turned. It was slower going, but offered more cover, more places to hide if pursuers caught up with them. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and amber, Caleb began looking for a place to shelter during the day. Travel would be too dangerous in daylight, they'd be too visible, and the heat would be punishing for both them and the horses. He found what he was looking for just as the sun crested the horizon, a deep overhang of rock that created a cave-like shelter, shaded from the sun and hidden from casual view. There was even a small seep of water pooling in a depression at the back, enough for the horses to drink and for them to refill their canteens. "We'll stay here until evening," Caleb said, leading the horses into the shade. "Rest, recover strength. Then we push hard again tonight." Ayana nodded, her exhaustion evident. She helped him unsaddle the horses, moving with the kind of practical competence that spoke to a childhood spent learning useful skills. When the animals were settled, she spread one of the blankets on the sandy floor and sat down heavily. "How long until we reach the settlement?" she asked. "2 more nights of hard riding, maybe 3 if we run into trouble," Caleb estimated. "We're making good time, but we have to be careful. Once they realize you're gone, they'll come after us." "And Wade?" He paused, thinking about the man who'd pushed so hard for harsh punishment. "Wade seems like someone who doesn't like losing. He'll want to make an example of both of us. What they'd do if they catch us?" Ayana asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "Nothing good," Caleb admitted. "For you, back to chains and prison. For me," he shrugged, "probably hanging for aiding an escape, maybe for treason against the territory. But they won't catch us. I won't let that happen." Ayana studied him in the growing light, her dark eyes thoughtful. "You give up everything for me. Your job, your home, your safety. I'm stranger to you. I do not understand." Caleb settled onto the ground across from her, his back against the cool rock wall. "I told myself for 15 years that I was just doing my duty, that following orders and enforcing laws was enough. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being a man who cared about justice and became a man who just enforced rules. And rules without conscience are just another kind of tyranny." He pulled out his father's Bible, running his hand over the worn leather cover. "My father was a preacher. He taught me that every human life has worth, that mercy matters more than law, that standing up for the powerless is the highest calling a person can have. But I'd forgotten all that, let it get buried under grief and bitterness and the daily grind of survival. Then why you remember now?" Ayana asked. "What change?" Caleb thought about that moment in the square when he'd heard her desperate plea, when he'd looked into her eyes and seen not an enemy, but a frightened girl who deserved better than what life had given her. "I saw you," he said simply. "Really saw you, not just as an Apache or a prisoner or a problem to be dealt with, but as a person, a daughter, someone's granddaughter. And I couldn't walk away from that, couldn't let you suffer when I had the power to help." Ayana was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. 6 years I'm captive. 6 years? People see me, but they not see me. I'm thing to them, not person. You are first one who see me, who treat me like I matter. I'd not forget that, ever. You do matter, Caleb said firmly. And when we get you to your people, when you're safe and free, you're going to have a chance to build a life that matters. To be more than what was done to you. What about you? She asked. When you leave me with my people, what you do? Where you go? It was a question Caleb had been avoiding. The truth was, he had no idea what came next for him. He was 53 years old, too old to start completely over, but too young to just give up. He couldn't go back to Redemption Springs, couldn't be a ranger anymore. His life as he'd known it was finished. I'll figure something out, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Maybe head north, find a place where I can work with my hands. Carpentry, farming, something honest and simple. You be alone, Ayana observed, not unkindly. I've been alone for 15 years, Caleb reminded her. I'm used to it. Being used to something not same as being happy with it, she said with surprising wisdom. Then more hesitantly, my people, they value courage. They respect those who help them. Maybe you not have to leave right away. Maybe you stay a while, let them know you. Let them thank you properly. The idea of staying, of being part of a community again, was both appealing and terrifying. We'll see, Caleb said noncommittally. First, we have to get there. As the day grew hotter, they settled into an uneasy rest. Caleb took the first watch, sitting at the edge of their shelter, where he could see the landscape stretching out below. The desert was beautiful in its harshness, endless variations of red and gold rock, scrubby vegetation clinging to life against all odds. A sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. He thought about Sarah Brennan, hoping she wouldn't face consequences for helping them. Thought about Sheriff Mackenzie, wondering if the old man was regretting his tacit assistance or feeling relieved to have finally acted on his conscience. Thought about the wooden horse sitting in his cabin, a symbol of the man he used to be and the man he was trying to become again. Around midday, Ayana woke and insisted on taking watch so Caleb could rest. He was too tired to argue, his body reminding him that he wasn't as young as he used to be. He dozed fitfully, his ranger's instincts keeping him partially alert even in sleep. He woke to find Ayana sitting cross-legged at the edge of the shelter, humming softly to herself. It was the first time he'd heard her make any sound that wasn't born of fear or pain. And the melody was hauntingly beautiful, something that spoke of open spaces and ancient traditions. That's a pretty song, he said. Sitting up and stretching his stiff muscles, she smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. My mother sing it to me when I am small. About eagle who flies so high he touches the sun. I think I forget it, but it come back now. Now that I am free, tell me about your family, Caleb said, wanting to know more about the people she'd been stolen from. Before you were taken, what were they like? Ayana's expression grew distant as she reached back into memories she'd tried to protect from the pain of her captivity. My father, he was good hunter, strong, patient. He'd teach me to track, to read signs in the earth. My mother, she make beautiful baskets, teach me about plants, which ones heal, which ones hurt. And my grandmother, her smile widened. She tells stories. All the old stories about how the world began, about Coyote and his tricks, about the spirits that live in the mountains and rivers. It sounds like you had a good childhood, Caleb said gently. I did. We were happy. Her expression darkened. Then the white men come, want our land. My father, he tried to make peace, tried to find way for both peoples to live. But some men, they not want peace. They want only to take. I'm sorry, Caleb said, and meant it. I'm sorry for what was done to you and your family. I'm sorry that my people have caused so much pain to yours. You not do it, Ayana pointed out. You just live in same skin color. That not make you guilty. But I didn't stop it either, Caleb said. For 15 years, I enforced laws that treated your people as less than human. I told myself I was maintaining order, but really I was maintaining injustice. That makes me complicit, maybe, Ayana conceded. But you stop now. You change. That count for something. They talked through the afternoon as the heat reached its peak and then began to slowly fade. Ayana told him more stories from her childhood, and Caleb found himself sharing memories of Emma, how she'd loved to climb trees, how she'd insisted on helping him in the garden, even though she was too small to really be useful, how her laugh had been the brightest sound in his world. It was healing. Somehow, to talk about these things with someone who understood loss. Ayana had lost her family too, had spent years not knowing if they were alive or dead, not knowing if she'd ever see them again. They shared a bond of grief that transcended the differences in their backgrounds. As evening approached and the shadows grew long, Caleb stood and began preparing for the night's ride. He checked their supplies, rationed out food and water, examined the horses to make sure they were fit to continue. "We need to cover as much ground as possible tonight," he said. "By tomorrow, Wade will have organized a pursuit party. We need to be far enough ahead that they can't catch us easily." Ayana nodded, her brief respite of peace giving way to the practical reality of their situation. "I am ready." "I'm strong enough." They saddled the horses and set out as the sun touched the western horizon, turning the landscape into a palette of orange and purple. The route took them through increasingly rugged terrain, narrow canyons where their horses' hooves echoed off stone walls, mesas that required careful navigation, areas where one wrong step could mean a fatal fall. But Caleb's military training and years of frontier experience served them well. He navigated by stars and landmarks, keeping them on course even when the path seemed impossible. And Ayana proved to be an excellent traveling companion, uncomplaining, alert, adapting quickly to the demands of desert travel. Around midnight, they stopped at one of the water sources marked on Mackenzie's map, a spring bubbling up from between rocks, creating a small pool that sustained a surprising amount of vegetation. They refilled their canteens and let the horses drink their fill. "We're making good time," Caleb said, studying the stars to confirm their position. "Another night and a half should get us there. And then?" Ayana asked. "And then you'll be free," Caleb said. "Really, truly free. No chains, no captors, no one to hurt you. Just life with your people, whatever that looks like." "It feel like dream," Ayana admitted. "Like I wake up and still be chained in the square." "It's not a dream," Caleb assured her. "This is real." "Your freedom is real, and nothing and no one is going to take it away from you again. I promise." It was another promise added to the weight he carried, but this one felt lighter than the others, because this was a promise he knew he could keep, would die keeping if necessary. They mounted again and rode through the remainder of the night, putting more miles between themselves and Redemption Springs, between their past and their future, between captivity and freedom, and somewhere behind them, though they didn't know it yet, Coleman Wade was gathering men and horses, his face dark with fury at being defied. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, and Wade had no intention of letting his prizes escape. 2 weeks later, Caleb stood at the edge of Redemption Springs as the sun set behind him, casting his shadow long across the dusty street. His wounds had healed enough to ride, though he still moved with a slight limp, and his side ached with every breath. But pain was secondary to purpose, and his purpose tonight was clear. Beside him stood 3 Apache warriors, young men who'd volunteered to help, their faces painted and their weapons ready. Behind them, hidden in the rocks at the town's edge, waited Ayana and a dozen more warriors, ready to intervene if things went wrong. In Caleb's pocket was a folded piece of paper, evidence that Sarah Brennan had spent 2 weeks quietly gathering. Records she'd found in Wade's office showing discrepancies in land purchases. Letters from Texas that confirmed Coleman Wade was actually Colt Whelan. Testimony from townsfolk who'd noticed odd behavior, unexplained absences, meetings with suspicious characters. It wasn't perfect evidence, but combined with Caleb's testimony and the confession he'd heard before being shot, it would be enough. It had to be enough. The message had reached Sarah through a young Apache scout who'd approached her store after dark, scaring her half to death before she recognized Ayana's medicine pouch he carried as proof of his legitimacy. Sarah had read Caleb's letter, understood what was needed, and set to work with the kind of quiet determination that had always defined her. Now, as the town settled in for the evening, Caleb prepared to walk back into the place that had been his home, to confront the man who'd tried to kill him, and to bring the truth into the light, regardless of the consequences. "You sure about this?" One of the warriors, a man named Kale, asked in careful English. "We can wait. Come back with more men. More men means more violence," Caleb said, "and violence is what Whelan wants. This needs to end with words and truth, not bullets and bloodshed. And if words not enough?" Kale pressed. Caleb touched the revolver at his hip, the rifle slung across his back. "Then we'll do what's necessary, but truth first. Justice first. That's how we win this without becoming like him." They moved into town carefully, using the growing darkness as cover. Most people were either home for dinner or at the saloon, exactly as Caleb had planned. He wanted witnesses for what was about to happen, but he wanted to choose his moment. They reached Sarah's store through the back entrance. She was waiting, her face pale but determined. When she saw Caleb alive, tears sprang to her eyes. "Thank God," she whispered, embracing him briefly. "Whelan told everyone you were dead. Said he found your body in the desert, buried you out there. I didn't want to believe him, but I'm hard to kill," Caleb said with a slight smile. "Do you have everything?" Sarah produced a leather portfolio, packed with the evidence she'd gathered. "It's all here. Bank records, letters, even a few people who were willing to write statements about suspicious activities they'd noticed. Not everyone in this town is blind, Caleb. Some of us have been having doubts about Coleman Wade for a while now." "Where's Mackenzie?" Caleb asked. "At his office. He's been—" Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "He's been different since you left, quieter, like something's weighing on him. I think he knows more than he's saying about what happened to you." "He helped us," Caleb said. "Gave me the information I needed to find the Apache settlement. I need to see him before we move against Whelan." They made their way through the darkening streets to the sheriff's office. Mackenzie was there, as Sarah had said, sitting at his desk with a half-empty bottle of whiskey and a haunted expression. When Caleb walked in, the old man's face went white. "Lord have mercy," Mackenzie breathed. "You're alive." Whelan says a lot of things," Caleb interrupted. "Most of them lies. We need to talk, Marcus, about who Coleman Wade really is, and about what you're going to do about it." Mackenzie stood up slowly, his eyes moving from Caleb to the Apache warriors, to Sarah and back to Caleb. "I thought you were dead. Whelan came back with blood on his hands, said you'd resisted arrest, that it ended badly. I didn't believe him, but I had no proof, no body, nothing to contradict his story." "You have proof now," Caleb said, placing Sarah's portfolio on the desk. "Evidence that Coleman Wade is actually Colt Whelan, wanted in Texas for murder and fraud. Evidence that he's been orchestrating raids on both sides to profit from the chaos. Evidence that he killed the Hendersons and framed innocent Apache for it." Mackenzie opened the portfolio with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the documents. With each page, his expression grew darker. This can't be—" "It's all real," Caleb said. "And you know it's real because it explains everything that never quite made sense. The way Wade pushed so hard for conflict. The way he was always first to suggest violence against Apache. The convenient raids that led to land sales. You knew something was wrong, Marcus. You just didn't want to see it." The sheriff sank back into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 60-plus years. "What do you want me to do?" "Your job," Caleb said simply. "Arrest Whelan. Hold him for trial. Make sure the truth comes out. He has support in this town," Mackenzie warned. "Men who'll stand with him. It could get ugly." "Then it gets ugly," Caleb said. "But we do this right. We do this with law and evidence, not with vengeance and violence. That's the only way to break the cycle he's been perpetuating." Mackenzie was quiet for a long moment, staring at the evidence spread across his desk. Then he stood up, straightened his shoulders, and pinned his badge more firmly to his chest. "You're right," he said. "I should have stood up to Wade weeks ago. Should have questioned his stories, investigated his background. But I was tired and scared and ready to retire without making waves." He met Caleb's eyes. "I'm not proud of that, but I can make it right now if you'll help me. That's why I'm here," Caleb assured him. Together they worked out a plan. Mackenzie would confront Whelan publicly at the saloon where the man held court most evenings, would present the evidence, make the accusations, and call for his arrest in front of the entire town. Caleb and the Apache warriors would be there as backup, ready to intervene if Whelan's supporters tried to prevent justice. It was risky. Whelan was charismatic and well-liked, and many townspeople would resist believing their respected leader was actually a criminal. But public exposure was the only way to prevent Whelan from talking his way out of private accusations, from making Caleb and Mackenzie look like the aggressors. As they prepared to move toward the saloon, Sarah touched Caleb's arm. "Be careful. Whelan is dangerous, and desperate men do desperate things. I know, Caleb said. But this has to end. Too many people have died already. Too much suffering has been caused. Tonight we put a stop to it. They walked through the dark streets, toward the sounds of music and laughter coming from the saloon. Caleb could see lamplight spilling from the windows. Could hear Wade's voice raised in some entertaining story that had people laughing. The man was in his element, beloved and trusted, with no idea that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse around him. Mackenzie opened the saloon doors and walked in with Caleb right behind him. The Apache warriors stayed outside for now, positioned to block any exits. The music stopped as people registered the sheriff's presence and the sudden appearance of Caleb, who everyone thought was dead. Whelan was standing at the bar, a drink in his hand and a smile on his face. The smile froze when he saw Caleb, and something dark and dangerous flickered across his features before he controlled it. "Well," Whelan said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "Caleb Stone, back from the dead. That's quite a trick." "No trick," Caleb said calmly. "Just harder to kill than you expected." The tension in the room ratcheted up instantly. People began moving away from Whelan, sensing the confrontation brewing. Some hands moved toward weapons. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Whelan said, "but walking into this town, after breaking a prisoner free and running from justice—" "I'm not the one who's been running from justice," Caleb interrupted. "You are, Colt Whelan." The use of his real name hit Whelan like a physical blow. For just a moment, his mask slipped, and everyone in the room could see the calculation and fear underneath. "I don't know what you're talking about," Whelan said. But his voice had lost some of its confidence. Sheriff Mackenzie stepped forward, holding up the wanted poster Sarah had found. "Colt Whelan, wanted in Texas for murder, fraud, and conspiracy. This is you, Wade, or should I say Whelan." "This is ridiculous," Whelan protested, but he was looking around the room now, assessing support, calculating odds. "This is some kind of desperate ploy by a fugitive and a sheriff who's lost his nerve." "We have bank records showing discrepancies in your land purchases," Caleb said, his voice cutting through Whelan's protests. "We have letters from Texas confirming your identity. We have witnesses who've noticed your suspicious activities. And I have your confession, your admission that you orchestrated the Henderson raid, that you've been staging attacks to profit from the chaos." "Lies," Whelan said, but his eyes were darting toward the exits. "All lies told by a man who betrayed his oath and an old man who's lost his grip on reality. Then why are you looking for ways to run?" Mackenzie asked quietly. "Innocent men don't plan their escape routes." The room was absolutely silent now, everyone watching the drama unfold. Caleb could see the moment when Whelan realized his silver tongue wasn't going to save him this time. When he understood that his carefully built reputation was crumbling, and he saw the moment when Whelan decided that if he was going down, he'd take as many people with him as possible. Whelan's hand moved toward his gun, and Caleb's instincts screamed a warning. But before either man could draw, the saloon doors burst open, and Ayanna walked in, flanked by two Apache warriors. The sight of her, alive, free, standing tall with her people behind her, stopped Whelan's hand. She walked through the crowd with her head high, her dark eyes fixed on the man who'd tried to destroy her. "I am Ayanna," she said, her English clearer and stronger than it had been weeks ago. "This man, he chained me in your square. He say I kill people. He lie, I not kill anyone. I'm prisoner trying to escape. This man," she pointed at Whelan, "he know this. He tell me before he chain me that he used me to hide his own crimes." "You're a savage," Whelan spat, losing his composure entirely now. "Why would anyone believe your word over mine?" "Because her word has the ring of truth," Reverend Hartwell said, standing up from where he'd been sitting in the corner. "And yours, I'm sorry to say, has the sound of a lie." He looked around at the gathered townspeople. "I've been troubled by many things these past weeks. The harshness of our judgments, the quickness of our anger, the way Coleman Wade always seemed to benefit from our conflicts. I think it's time we listen to different voices. Others began speaking up then, Sarah sharing what she'd found, Doc Morrison admitting doubts about Wade's version of events. Even a few of Wade's former supporters, unwilling to defend a man whose lies were becoming undeniable. Caleb watched as Whelan's support crumbled, as the truth ate away at his carefully constructed facade. And he saw the moment when Whelan's face went from calculation to pure rage. "You want the truth?" Whelan snarled. "Fine, I'll give you the truth." He reached toward his gun again, and this time nothing stopped him. The confrontation was about to turn deadly, and Caleb braced himself for the violence he'd hoped to avoid. Whelan's hand closed around his revolver, but Caleb was faster. His own weapon was drawn and aimed before Whelan cleared leather, the hammer already cocked, his grey eyes steady over the barrel. "Don't," Caleb said quietly. "You can't shoot your way out of this. There are too many witnesses, too much truth in the open now. Put the gun down and face justice with whatever dignity you have left." "Dignity?" Whelan laughed bitterly. "You lecture me about dignity? You who threw away everything to save one worthless Apache girl? You're a fool, Stone. This territory doesn't reward dignity. It rewards strength and cunning and the willingness to do whatever it takes to survive. Is that what you call it?" Caleb asked. "Murder and fraud and turning people against each other for profit? That's not survival. That's evil dressed up in fancy words." Whelan's grip on his weapon tightened, and Caleb could see the calculation in his eyes, measuring distances, evaluating odds, looking for any path forward that didn't end with him in chains or dead. "You won't shoot me," Whelan said with sudden confidence. "Not in cold blood, not in front of all these witnesses. You're too principled for that, too bound by your outdated code of honor. That's always been your weakness, Stone." "Maybe," Caleb acknowledged. "But I'm not the only one with a gun, aimed at you right now." Whelan's eyes flickered to the sides and realized with dawning horror that at least a dozen weapons were now trained on him. Apache warriors who'd moved into position, townspeople who'd finally understood what he really was. Even Sheriff Mackenzie with his own revolver drawn. "You're surrounded," Mackenzie said, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd been reluctant to wield before. "Or put down your weapon and submit to arrest, or we'll put you down where you stand. Your choice." For a long moment, Whelan stood frozen, his face a mask of rage and desperation. Then his expression shifted into something colder, more calculated. He slowly lowered his gun, but instead of dropping it, he grabbed the nearest person, a young woman who'd been standing too close, and pulled her in front of him as a shield. "Nobody moves," Whelan snarled, pressing his gun to the woman's head. "Or she dies. I walk out of here free, or you all watch her blood paint these walls." The woman whimpered in fear, and Caleb's jaw tightened. This was what happened when cornered criminals had nothing left to lose. Innocent people became pawns in their desperate attempts at escape. "Let her go, Whelan," Caleb said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Killing her won't help you. It'll just add another murder to the charges you're facing." "I'm already facing the noose," Whelan shot back. "What's one more death on my conscience? Now back off, all of you, or I swear I'll pull this trigger." The standoff stretched out, tense and terrible. The woman was crying silently, her eyes squeezed shut. Everyone with a weapon kept them trained on Whelan, but nobody dared fire for fear of hitting the hostage. Caleb's mind raced through options. A headshot was risky, too much chance of hitting the woman. Waiting him out might work, but desperation made people unpredictable. Whelan might kill the hostage anyway, just to prove he was serious, to create chaos he could exploit. Then Ayanna moved, so quietly that Caleb almost didn't notice until she was in position behind Whelan. She'd circled around through the crowd, with the fluid silence of someone who'd learned to be invisible during 6 years of captivity. In her hand was something small that glinted in the lamplight, a shard of broken mirror, sharp as any knife. Their eyes met across the room, and Caleb understood what she was planning. He gave the tiniest nod of acknowledgement, then deliberately raised his voice to focus Whelan's attention. "You're right," Caleb said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You're facing the noose either way, so maybe we should talk about a deal." Maybe there's a way out of this that doesn't end with you dead. Whelan's attention locked onto Caleb, suspicious but interested. What kind of deal? Testimony, Caleb said, improvising. You know things about the criminal networks operating in this territory. Names, locations, operations. That information has value. Maybe enough value to negotiate a prison sentence instead of execution. It was bait, and not particularly subtle bait, but Whelan's ego made him vulnerable to the idea that he still had leverage. While he considered Caleb's words, his grip on the hostage loosened slightly, his attention diverted from what was happening behind him. Ayana struck with the precision of a hunter. The mirror shard slashed across the back of Whelan's gun hand, cutting deep enough to make him cry out and drop his weapon. The hostage broke free and stumbled away, and in the instant of chaos that followed, three things happened simultaneously. Whelan lunged for his fallen gun. Caleb fired, the bullet striking the floor inches from Whelan's reaching hand, sending splinters of wood into his face. And Kaylee, the Apache warrior, moved forward with startling speed and struck Whelan across the temple with the butt of his rifle, dropping him unconscious to the floor. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of the freed hostage sobbing in relief. Then the room erupted into noise, people talking all at once, some praising what had happened, others still uncertain. A few angry at the Apache presence in their town, Mackenzie moved forward with iron shackles, the same ones that had bound Ayana in the square weeks ago. He locked them around Whelan's wrists with a grim satisfaction that suggested a measure of personal redemption in the act. It's over, the sheriff said, looking around the room. Coleman Wade, Colt Whelan, is under arrest for murder, fraud, conspiracy, and about a dozen other charges. He'll be held for trial, and this time there won't be any question about guilt or innocence. What about the Apache? Someone called from the back. They came into our town armed. That's an act of war. They came to see justice served, Caleb corrected, his voice carrying clearly. And they helped stop a dangerous criminal from killing an innocent woman. If that's an act of war, then I hope for more such acts. He looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as he could. I know many of you are uncomfortable with what you've seen tonight. Apache warriors in your saloon, a young woman you were taught to see as an enemy, standing here as a witness to truth. But I'm asking you to look past your discomfort and see what really happened. He gestured to Ayana. This woman was chained in your square, awaiting punishment for crimes she didn't commit. She was going to be sent to prison or worse, all because a man who pretended to care about your safety was actually using your fear to profit. I broke her chains because it was right, and I'd do it again without hesitation. You broke the law, Benjamin Cross said, but his voice lacked its former certainty. I broke a bad law that was being used to perpetrate injustice, Caleb agreed. And I'd break it again. Because sometimes being lawful and being just aren't the same thing, and when forced to choose, I choose justice. Reverend Hartwell stood again, his voice carrying the moral authority of his position. The scriptures tell us that mercy and truth are met together, that righteousness and peace have kissed each other. What we witness tonight is what happens when we choose truth over comfortable lies, when we choose mercy over blind vengeance. I, for one, am grateful to Ranger Stone and to these Apache people for showing us a better way. There were murmurs of agreement, though not everyone looked convinced. Changing hearts and minds would take time, Caleb knew. But seeds had been planted tonight. Seeds of doubt about old assumptions. Seeds of possibility that maybe, just maybe, settlers and Apache could coexist without constant conflict. Whelan began to stir, groaning as consciousness returned. Mackenzie hauled him to his feet without gentleness, and Whelan's eyes, when they focused, were filled with pure hatred directed at Caleb. You think you've won, Whelan spat, blood running from his split lip. You think exposing me changes anything? This territory runs on violence and fear. Take me away, and someone else will step into my place. The system I exploited will still be there, ready for the next person smart enough to use it. Maybe, Caleb acknowledged. But you won't be there to profit from it. And that's a start. A start to what? Whelan laughed bitterly. Your naive fantasy of peace? of settlers and savages living together in harmony. You're a fool if you think one night of truth-telling will change generations of hatred. I don't think it will change everything, Caleb said quietly, but I think it might change something, and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes one person standing up for what's right creates a crack in the wall, and other people start seeing through that crack to possibilities they couldn't imagine before. Mackenzie began leading Whelan toward the door, and the crowd parted to let them through. As they passed Ayana, Whelan spat at her feet. "Savage," he hissed. "You'll always be a savage to these people, no matter what tricks you pull tonight." Ayana looked at him with something approaching pity. "You are the savage. You kill for money, lie for power, hurt people because you can. I survived 6 years of captivity and still have hope for a better future. Who is more human, me or you?" Whelan had no answer to that, and Mackenzie hauled him away into the night. The saloons slowly emptied as people drifted back to their homes, their conversations quiet and thoughtful rather than angry or fearful. Sarah approached Caleb as he was reloading his revolver, preparing to leave. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we see if justice can actually be served," Caleb said. "Whelan will face trial. The evidence we gathered will be presented, and either the system works the way it's supposed to, or it doesn't, and if it doesn't, then we keep fighting," Caleb said simply. "We keep standing up for what's right, keep telling the truth, keep breaking the chains that bind people unjustly, because the alternative is accepting that might makes right and lies win over truth. I can't accept that." "Not anymore," Sarah smiled, a warm expression that made her look younger. "I'm glad you came back, Caleb. This town needs people like you. People who remember that laws should serve justice, not replace it." "I'm not staying," Caleb said gently. "I can't. I'm a fugitive from the law I broke to free Ayana. Even if Whelan is convicted, I still face charges. Then we'll fight those too," Sarah said firmly. "You saved an innocent girl and exposed a murderer. Any system that punishes you for that isn't worth defending." Caleb was touched by her loyalty, but didn't share her optimism about his chances. The law was clear about aiding prisoners to escape, regardless of whether those prisoners were innocent. He'd committed a crime by the letter of the law, even if the spirit of justice was on his side. Ayana joined them, with Kayleigh and the other Apache warriors close behind. "We go now," she said. "Stay longer is not safe," she was right. The immediate crisis had passed, but Apache people in a settler town at night was never truly safe. Too much history, too much pain on both sides. "Thank you," Caleb said to her, and to the warriors who'd risked themselves to help. "You saved that woman's life tonight. Saved mine too, probably. Whelan would have found a way to shoot me if you hadn't moved when you did. We help because you help us," Kayleigh said simply. "This is what honor requires." They moved toward the door, and Caleb followed them out into the night. The street was mostly empty now, though he could see curtains moving in windows as people watched the Apache delegation leave town. At the edge of Redemption Springs, where the buildings gave way to open desert, Ayana turned back to face Caleb. "You come with us." "Back to the people?" Caleb shook his head. "I need to see this through. Make sure Whelan faces justice. Make sure the truth gets told in court, not just in a saloon." "And after?" Ayana pressed. "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "But whatever happens, I'm grateful I met you, Ayana. Grateful you helped me remember what matters and what doesn't. You saved me as much as I saved you." She stepped forward and embraced him briefly, a gesture that surprised him with its warmth. "You are good man, Caleb Stone. You have good soul. Whatever happens, you remember that. You remember that breaking my chains was best thing you ever do." "I will," Caleb promised, his voice rough with emotion. He watched them disappear into the darkness, Ayana and her people heading back to their settlement, back to their lives. And he stood there in the space between the town and the desert, between his past and his uncertain future, with his dented badge heavy in his pocket and his conscience finally, blessedly clear. Behind him, Redemption Springs settled into an uneasy quiet, the events of the night already becoming story, already being shaped by those who'd witnessed it into whatever narrative fit their worldview. But the truth remained, solid and immutable beneath all the interpretations. Colt Whelan was in chains. Ayanna was free. And justice, for once, had been served not through violence and vengeance, but through courage and truth. It wasn't everything. It wouldn't fix all the problems between settlers and Apache. It wouldn't undo the years of hurt and hatred. But it was something. A crack in the wall, as Caleb had said. A glimpse of how things could be different. If enough people chose courage over comfort, Caleb turned back toward town, toward whatever consequences awaited him, and walked forward with his head high and his steps steady. He'd broken chains and broken laws, but he'd kept faith with himself and with the values his father had tried to teach him. And in the end, that was all a man could do, try to leave the world a little better than he'd found it. One freed prisoner at a time, one exposure of injustice at a time, one act of courage at a time. The rest was up to God and history to judge. 3 months later, Caleb stood in the morning sun outside what used to be his cabin in Redemption Springs, packing the last of his belongings onto Copper's back. The trial was over, the verdict rendered, and his own fate decided. Colt Whelan had been convicted on all charges and sentenced to hang. The evidence Sarah had gathered, combined with testimony from multiple witnesses and the records that proved his true identity, had been overwhelming. Even his silver tongue couldn't talk his way out of the truth when it was laid bare in a court of law. As for Caleb, the territorial judge had taken an unusual step. After hearing the full circumstances, Ayanna's innocence, Whelan's crimes, the systematic injustice that had been perpetrated, he'd issued a pardon for Caleb's actions in freeing her. Not because the law approved of breaking prisoners free, but because, as the judge had said, sometimes the law fails so completely that the only just course is to acknowledge its failure and commend those who acted on conscience rather than statute. It had been a controversial decision. Some townspeople had celebrated it, seeing Caleb as a hero who'd exposed corruption and saved an innocent girl. Others had condemned it, arguing that it set a dangerous precedent for people to ignore laws they disagreed with. But the decision stood, and Caleb was free. Free to stay in Redemption Springs, to resume his position as ranger, to return to the life he'd known for 15 years. He'd chosen to leave anyway. You sure about this? Sheriff Mackenzie asked, watching Caleb secure his belongings. The older man looked better than he had in months, standing straighter, his eyes clearer. The trial and its aftermath had been hard on him, but he'd found a kind of peace in finally standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. "I'm sure," Caleb said. "This town doesn't need me anymore, Marcus. It needs people like you and Sarah, people who'll keep fighting for justice, even when I'm not here to push them. And I need," he paused, searching for words, "I need to see what comes next. Who I can be now that I'm not just a ranger enforcing other people's laws. Where will you go?" "North, I think. Maybe Montana. I hear there's work for men with my skills, and land for those willing to work it. A chance to build something new, alone." Mackenzie asked, though there was a knowing look in his eyes. Caleb smiled slightly. "Maybe not completely alone." As if summoned by the words, Sarah appeared from her store, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. She closed the shop for the morning, claimed she needed to see him off properly. "Food for the journey," she said, handing him the basket. "And before you argue, I'm coming with you, at least as far as the next town. Someone needs to make sure you don't get yourself killed before you've had a chance to enjoy your freedom." Caleb had known this conversation was coming. They'd grown closer during the trial, during the long evenings spent preparing testimony and evidence. Sarah had been his anchor during the uncertainty, his reminder that there were still good people in the world worth fighting for. "Sarah, you have a business here. In life, I have a store that I can sell, and a life that's been on hold for 6 years, she interrupted gently. "Since my daughter died, I've been going through the motions, Caleb, surviving but not really living. But these past months, helping you, seeing you fight for what's right, that's reminded me what it feels like to be part of something that matters." "I can't promise you anything," Caleb warned. "I don't know what the future holds, where I'll end up, whether I'll even be successful at whatever I try next." "I'm not asking for promises," Sarah said. I'm asking for a chance. A chance to see if maybe we can build something together. Two people who've both lost too much, but still have hope for something better. Mackenzie cleared his throat diplomatically. I'll just go check on things at the office. Give you two some privacy. After he left, Caleb and Sarah stood in the morning light, the moment stretching between them with possibility and uncertainty. I'd like that, Caleb said finally. The company, I mean. And the chance. I'd like both very much. Sarah's smile was like sunrise. Then let's not waste any more time standing here. We have a lot of miles ahead of us. They rode out together an hour later, heading north under skies so blue they hurt to look at. The desert gradually gave way to scrubland, and scrubland to grassland, and with each mile, Caleb felt the weight of the past lifting from his shoulders. They stopped for lunch, near a stream, and Caleb pulled out his father's Bible, while Sarah unpacked the food she'd brought. He opened it to a passage he'd marked weeks ago, words that had taken on new meaning through everything he'd experienced. What is it? Sarah asked, seeing him reading. Something my father used to quote, Caleb said, from the book of Micah. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God? I've been thinking about that a lot lately. About what it means to actually do justice, not just enforce laws. And what conclusion have you reached? Sarah asked. That justice requires courage, Caleb said. Courage to stand up against wrong even when it's popular or profitable. Courage to see people as human beings rather than categories. Courage to break chains, literal and figurative, when those chains are unjust. He closed the Bible and looked at Sarah. I'm not a young man anymore. I'm 53 years old with scars inside and out. I don't know how many good years I have left or what I'll do with them. But I know I want to spend them trying to be the man my father raised me to be, the man my daughter would have been proud of. And I know I'd like you beside me while I try. Sarah reached across the space between them and took his hand. I'm 46 years old with scars of my own. But I'd be honored to be beside you, Caleb Stone, to see what we can build together in whatever time we're given. They continued north for another week, and then their path diverged. Caleb turned east, toward a small settlement, where word had reached him that a community needed help establishing fair law enforcement. Sarah headed to the territorial capital to finalize the sale of her store and settle her affairs, with plans to join him in a month. But before they parted, they made a detour, east toward the Apache settlement where Ayana lived. They arrived in the evening, and Nayeli greeted them with the warmth of old friends. Caleb Stone, Sarah Brennan, you are welcome in our home. Ayana ran out when she heard they'd arrived, her face lighting up with joy. She'd grown in the months since Caleb had last seen her, not just physically, though she'd filled out and looked healthier, but in confidence and peace. She wore traditional Apache clothing now, beautifully made and decorated, and her hair was adorned with beads that caught the fading sunlight. Caleb, she cried, embracing him without hesitation. You come to visit. I'm so happy to see you. I wanted to see how you were doing, Caleb said, returning the embrace. Make sure you are settling in well. I am more than well, Ayana said, her English much improved. I am home. I learned from grandmother, help with children, find my place with the people again. And you, the trial, they say you are pardoned, that you are free. I'm free, Caleb confirmed. Thanks in large part to your testimony. You were brave to speak in that courtroom, to face all those people who judged you so harshly. I learned from you, Ayana said simply. You show me that courage is not being unafraid. Courage is being afraid, but doing right thing anyway. They stayed for 2 days, sharing meals and stories with Ayana's people. Caleb taught some of the younger warriors tracking techniques he'd learned during the war. Sarah shared medical knowledge with the settlement's healers, and in the quiet moments they saw a glimpse of what peace between peoples could look like. Not perfect, not without misunderstanding or difficulty, but possible if enough people chose understanding over fear. On the morning they prepared to leave, Ayana presented Caleb with a gift, a woven bracelet in red, blue, and white, the same colors that had decorated her medicine pouch. My grandmother made this, she said, tying it around his wrist. She say it is symbol of bond between you and our people. Symbol that you are friend to the Apache, that you are man of honor. You wear this, and any of the people who see it know you are to be trusted. Caleb looked at the bracelet, at the intricate weaving and the care that had gone into its creation, and felt his throat tighten with emotion. I'll wear it with pride, and I'll try every day to be worthy of the trust it represents. You already worthy, Ayana said. You prove that when you break my chains. She reached into a pouch at her waist and pulled out something else, a small carved bird, worn smooth by handling. The same bird that had been in her medicine pouch that Caleb had saved from the dust of Redemption Springs Square. You keep this safe for me when I have nothing, she said. Now I give it to you, to keep safe your spirit like you keep safe mine. When you look at it, remember, freedom is gift that must be protected, must be given to others when they trapped. You give this gift to me. Now I give it to you, so you remember to keep giving it to others who need it. Caleb accepted the carved bird, its small form fitting perfectly in his palm. I'll remember, I promise. As they rode away from the settlement, Caleb looked back one last time. Ayana stood with her grandmother, waving, surrounded by her people and her reclaimed life. The chains that had bound her were broken and forgotten. The future stretched ahead of her, full of possibility, and Caleb realized that this moment of seeing someone he'd saved, not just surviving but thriving, was worth everything it had cost. Worth his position, his reputation, his comfortable routine. Worth all of it and more. They rode north under endless skies, toward whatever future awaited them. Caleb touched the bracelet on his wrist and the small carved bird in his pocket, symbols of connection and hope, and felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. Not just peace, but joy. Not just acceptance, but anticipation. Sarah rode beside him, their horses matching pace naturally, and occasionally their eyes would meet and they'd smile. Two people who'd found each other late in life, but not too late. Who'd discovered that it was never too late to start over, to choose courage over comfort, to build something new from the ashes of what had been lost. The sun set behind them, painting the western sky in golds and roses, and ahead the stars began to appear, constant and patient. The trail stretched out endlessly, and for the first time in a very long time, Caleb looked forward to seeing where it led. He'd been a soldier, a father, a widower, a ranger, a rebel, and a fugitive. Now he was simply a man trying to do right by the world and by himself, trying to honor the people he'd loved and lost by living with the courage they would have wanted for him. It wasn't a perfect ending. There were still injustices in the territory, still conflicts between settlers and Apache, still men like Whelan who would try to profit from suffering. But there were also people like Ayana and Sarah and Mackenzie, people willing to stand up for what was right even when it was hard, and that, Caleb thought, was enough. Maybe not to fix everything, but enough to make a difference. Enough to matter. He touched his dented badge, which he'd kept even though he no longer wore it. The bullet that had struck it during the confrontation with Whelan had transformed it from a symbol of blind duty into a symbol of earned honor. He would carry it always, not as a reminder of what he'd been, but as a reminder of what he'd become, a man who'd finally learned to break chains, including his own. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. And as Caleb Stone rode into the gathering darkness, with Sarah Brennan beside him, he felt something he'd thought lost forever. Hope, simple, enduring, unshakable hope that tomorrow would be better than yesterday, that courage and compassion could still change the world, and that even broken people could find wholeness again if they were brave enough to try. The stars grew brighter. The trail led onward, and somewhere behind them, in an Apache settlement under the same endless sky, a young woman who'd survived 6 years of captivity and found her way home, stood with her grandmother and told old stories around the fire. Stories about chains being broken, about courage in the face of fear, about the unexpected bonds that could form between people who should have been enemies. Stories that would be passed down through generations. Becoming legend, becoming myth, becoming the kind of truth that transcends facts, the kind of truth that reminds people, in every age and every place, that standing up for what's right is always worth the cost, always.